A mail-order bride receipt with another man's name on it, found inside his own house, 2 weeks after the wedding. That's how rancher Everett Kane discovered the woman he married was already owned, and the man who owned her was coming to collect. If you're new here, hit subscribe and that bell right now because this story doesn't slow down and you don't want to miss what comes next. Watch until the very end and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. The coffee cup hit the floor and shattered, and for one suspended moment, Everett Kane simply stood there, staring at the pieces scattered across the kitchen boards like something irreplaceable had just come apart. His hand had gone numb. That happened sometimes, a sudden nerve-deep coldness that traveled up his arm when his body registered danger before his mind could catch up. He'd learned to trust that cold. His wife stood 3 feet away. Her name was Nora. 6 months ago, she'd stepped off a stagecoach in Ridgeline, Wyoming, with a single trunk and a quiet dignity that had impressed him more than beauty ever could. She'd answered his advertisement in the Continental Marriage Registry with 2 pages of careful measured handwriting, not flirtatious, not desperate, simply honest. She wanted safety. She wanted a life built on something solid. He had offered her both. Now she stood in the center of his kitchen with her back pressed to the wall, and she was barely recognizable. Purple bruising mapped her jaw like a map of some terrible country. Her left eye was swollen completely shut, the skin around it gone the deep, ripe color of a late-season plum. Her lower lip was split, a fresh crease of dark red that hadn't yet crusted. She held one arm across her stomach, guarding it. He realized the way people held broken ribs. "I fell," she said. Her voice came out barely above a whisper. "On the porch steps. You know how slick they get in the morning." Everett said nothing. He had spent 11 years as a range scout for the Territorial Army before buying this land. He had tracked Comanche raiders through 3-day blizzards and followed cattle thieves across ground that left no visible prints. He had crouched in the dark beside men who were trying very hard to appear like something other than what they were. He knew the look. He knew the tone. He knew the way a person's good eye tracked your face when they were waiting to see if you believed them. He didn't believe her. He moved to the table slowly, deliberately, and that's when his boot caught the edge of something on the floor beside her sewing basket. He looked down, a crumpled piece of paper half shoved beneath the basket's woven base as if it had been pushed there in a hurry. He bent and picked it up. He smoothed it flat against the table. It was a receipt from the Continental Marriage Agency, formal letterhead, careful typeface, the kind of document that carried the weight of legal transaction. His eyes moved down the columns, date, payment, rendered, client identification, and then stopped. The groom's name wasn't his. Silas Vane, groom of record, payment received in full, betrothal confirmed and witnessed. The date was stamped clearly at the bottom, 2 weeks after Everett and Nora had stood in front of the circuit preacher and exchanged vows. The air in the kitchen turned to ice. Nora's good eye went wide. She had seen him find it. She had seen him read it. Now she watched him the way a person watches a fuse, not sure yet whether it leads somewhere terrible. "Everett," she started. "Don't." His voice came out flat, not angry, worse than angry, empty, scraped clean of everything except the need to understand. "Don't tell me you fell again." She pressed herself back against the wall, and he hated that she flinched, hated that whatever had happened to her had made her expect that being cornered meant being struck. He set the receipt on the table between them like a document entered into evidence. "You want to explain this?" he said quietly. She didn't answer right away. Her hands were shaking at her sides, small contained tremors she was trying to suppress. He could see her fighting for composure, and he waited because he was a man who understood that some truths needed a moment to gather themselves before they could be spoken. "He found me," she finally said. Just that, 2 words, like an ending. "Who found you?" "Silas?" The name came out of her like something she'd been carrying too long and finally dropped. "Silas Vane." Everett looked at the receipt again, at the careful handwriting, at the official seals. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Start from the beginning," he said. He pulled out a chair from the kitchen table, not for her, not yet, and sat in it himself because this was going to take a while and he needed to be the kind of calm she required right now. "Sit down. Tell me everything." And this time Nora the truth. She sat. For a long moment she simply looked at her own hands, at the trembling she could no longer quite suppress. Then she began. Her father had owed Silas Vane money, not a small amount, a staggering sum accumulated over years of bad harvests and worse decisions, loans taken from a man who dealt in debt the way other men dealt in land. When her father died, the debt didn't die with him. Silas had come to collect on the only asset the old man had left his daughter. He called it a betrothal contract, Nora said. Her voice was steady now, but brittle like ice over shallow water. Had it witnessed by a notary. My father signed it 6 months before he passed. Said Silas was a good match, wealthy, powerful. Said I should be grateful. But you ran. She nodded. The week before the ceremony, I saw what he did to a woman who worked in his house. She dropped a dish, just a dish, Everett. He beat her until she couldn't stand. Her hand rose involuntarily to her own bruised jaw. I knew if I married him, I'd end up like her, or worse. Everett said nothing, but something moved behind his eyes, a deep, slow thing, like a current running beneath still water. I contacted the Continental Marriage Agency, she continued, used my mother's maiden name, paid with what little I had left, told them I needed to be matched with someone far enough away that Silas would never think to look. She paused. They sent me to you. And you didn't tell me any of this before we were married. It wasn't an accusation exactly, but it carried the weight of one. I was afraid. Her voice cracked on the word just slightly. Not of you, of what would happen if Silas found out before I was somewhere safe. She stopped, swallowed. I thought if I was already married, already established somewhere, he didn't know that it would be over, that he wouldn't be able to reach me. Everett tapped the receipt with one finger, but he found out. There was a clerk at the agency, man named Olin. Her hands curled in her lap. I think Silas bribed him, paid him to go through the placement records and find where the agency had sent women who had used changed names. She looked up. He came here 3 nights ago, while you were in town settling accounts with the cattle buyers. The kitchen clock ticked into the silence. Everett went very still. What did he do? She told him. Silas Vane had ridden up to the ranch after dark with 2 men at his back. He'd knocked on the door, and when she'd opened it, he'd smiled at her, that cold, deliberate smile she remembered from Missouri, the one that never reached his eyes. He'd told her the betrothal contract was still valid, that marriage to a dirt rancher didn't override a legally witnessed agreement, that she belonged to him and always had. When she told him she was a married woman now, and he had no claim on her, he'd hit her. Just once, the first time. A reminder, he'd called it. A demonstration of what happened to women who forgot their obligations. He said he's giving you 1 week. Nora said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. To dissolve the marriage willingly. After that, he'll take me anyway. And he'll burn this ranch to the ground for... She stopped, looked at her hands. He said for harboring stolen property. Stolen property. The words settled into the room like stones into still water. Everett stood, walked to the window, and looked out at his land, 30 years of combined labor and stubbornness, stretching wide under a gray Wyoming sky. He had built this place from nothing. 2 rooms and a lean-to when he'd first staked the claim. He had put his hands into this earth and pulled something livable out of it, season after season, drought and blizzard and all. He thought about what Silas Vane had called his wife, stolen property. You should have told me, he said finally. He kept his voice even because she had been through enough already without him making it worse. Before we stood in front of that preacher, you should have trusted me. I know. Tears streaked silently down her bruised face. I'm sorry, I'll go if you want. I can disappear again. Try somewhere else. Start over. Stop talking. She froze. He turned from the window. His expression was unreadable, not cold exactly, but controlled in the way of a man who had learned long ago that the moments requiring the most action demanded the least visible emotion. You're not going anywhere, he said. But Silas can go to hell. His voice was quiet, absolute. You're my wife. That makes you my responsibility. And no man, I don't care how much money he has, how many judges he owns, how many hired guns ride at his back, no man puts his hands on what's mine and walks away from it whole. Nora stared at him. You're going to fight him. I'm going to end him. Everett. She stood, and he could see the desperation rising in her, the fear that had lived in her bones for so long, it had become structural. You don't understand. He's not just wealthy. He controls shipping contracts along 3 river territories. He has men, real men, dangerous men on his payroll. He owns half the territorial judges between here and Kansas City. If you challenge him, he won't just fight back. He'll destroy everything you've built. Let him try. Please. She crossed the space between them, stopped just short of touching him. Just let me go. I can disappear again. You don't have to carry this. Sit down, Nora. Something in his tone made her comply. Not out of fear, he thought, but out of something else. Recognition, maybe. The same instinct that had made her trust a stranger's advertisement months ago. He pulled a chair close to hers and sat facing her close enough that she could see his eyes clearly. I'm going to ask you one question, he said, and I need the honest answer. She nodded. Do you want to be free of him? She didn't hesitate, more than anything. Then we do this my way. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, his voice dropping to something private and precise. No more secrets, no more managing information to protect me from things I need to know. You tell me everything, every detail about Silas Vane, about his operation, his men, his habits, his weaknesses, and then we plan. Plan what? How to make sure he never touches you again. Something moved across her face, something fragile and tentative, like the first green thing pushing up through frozen ground. Hope. Dangerous hope, the kind that had been disappointed enough times to have learned caution. You really think we can beat him? She asked. A man like that, Everett's voice was certain. I know we can. How? Because men like Silas Vane all make the same fatal mistake. He almost smiled, a hard private expression that didn't quite reach warmth. They start believing their own reputation. They think money and power make them untouchable. They forget that out here, beyond the railroad corridors and the territorial courthouses, there's still wild country. And wild country has its own rules. Nora studied his face. She had been watching him for 6 months, cataloging him the way a careful woman catalogs a man. She isn't yet sure she can trust his habits, his silences, his responses to difficulty. She thought she had understood him fairly well. She was realizing now that she had only understood the surface. Who were you? She asked. Before this ranch, before all this? Someone who survived worse than Silas Vane. He stood moved to a locked cabinet in the far corner and produced a small key from inside his boot. That's all you need to know for now. The cabinet opened. Inside, Nora saw things that didn't belong to the quiet rancher she had spent half a year learning a gun belt with a revolver worn smooth from long use. 2 rifles she hadn't known existed. Maps spread across the lower shelf marked with trail routes and camp positions in careful notations. You were a soldier, she breathed. Range scout, territorial boundary work, some conflicts along the southern border. He checked the revolver's cylinder, loaded clean, and set it on the table without ceremony. Thought I was done with all that when I staked this claim. Thought I'd built far enough out that the old life couldn't find me. I brought it to your door. He looked at her. Really looked at her past the bruises and the fear at the woman who had been running long enough that she'd nearly forgotten what standing still felt like. No, he said quietly. You brought yourself. The war was already following you. All you did was trust me enough to let me stand between you and it. He set the second rifle on the table beside the first. Now start talking. Tell me about Silas, his operation. How many men does he ride with when he travels? She straightened in her chair. Something in her posture shifted, the hunched defensiveness unwinding, replaced by something more angular, more deliberate. She had spent months being afraid. She understood now that fear had its uses, but this wasn't one of them. Usually 2, she said, sometimes 3, all armed. He doesn't go anywhere without at least 1 man who's killed before. His routine, when he travels, what roads does he favor? He prefers main routes. He likes to be seen. It's part of how he controls people's visibility. The knowledge that he's present, that he's watching. Good. Everett pulled out paper and a pencil, set them in front of her. Write that down. Everything you remember about his habits, his properties, his contacts, who he owes favors to and who owes them to him. He pulled a chair beside her and sat. Start with the agency clerk. This Olin, do you know where he's based? Nora thought. Creston, it's a small post town about 20 miles south. He runs correspondence out of the territorial post office there. Perfect. Everett's mind was already moving, assembling pieces into a pattern. We start there. Start what? Gathering evidence. He tapped the paper. If Silas bribed a post office clerk to breach private agency records, that's a federal crime mail fraud at minimum. Interference with federal correspondence. We get that clerk to sign a sworn statement. We've got something a territorial judge can't dismiss. Nora blinked. You're going to use the law against him, among other things. But he owns the judges. Territorial judges. He met her eyes. Federal jurisdiction is a different animal. Silas's money doesn't reach as far as he thinks it does. For the first time since he'd walked into the kitchen and found her broken against the wall, something that wasn't fear lived in Nora's face. She picked up the pencil, her hands had steadied. She began to write. Outside, the Wyoming wind pushed dust across the yard in slow spirals. The sky was going gray at the edges, early evening settling in from the north, the particular gray that promised cold by morning. Everett watched his wife write and felt something clarify inside him, a sense of purpose, clean and hard, like a blade that has been properly sharpened. 3 nights ago, a man had come to this house in the dark and put his hands on her. That man had made his first mistake by leaving her alive enough to talk. He was about to make his second by assuming that 1 week was sufficient time for Everett Kane to prepare. Everett loaded fresh rounds into both rifles, checked the chambers with quiet efficiency. He thought about the clerk in Creston. He thought about the maps in the cabinet and the trails marked on them. He thought about 11 years of learning exactly how men like Silas Vane operated from a distance through intermediaries behind the cover of paperwork and legitimate seeming authority. He thought about how every pattern of control had somewhere inside it a single thread. Pull that thread correctly and the whole thing unraveled. One more thing, he said quietly, not looking up from the rifle. Nora paused in her writing. When this is over, when Vane is handled, and this is done, I want you to make me a promise. She looked at him. What kind of promise? That you'll stay. His voice was steady, unhurried. Not because you're afraid of what comes next. Not because you need protection, but because you choose to. Nora was quiet for a long moment. The lamp threw warm light across the bruises on her face, and she looked older than she was, and younger too, in the way that people look when they've been carrying something heavy long enough that it has changed the shape of them. I already choose to, she said. Just that, soft and certain. Then we fight together, he said. She nodded and returned to writing. Neither of them noticed the shadow that slid briefly across the far window there and gone in the space of a breath, barely distinguishable from the shifting of wind-driven cloud. Neither of them saw the boot prints pressed into the dry dirt beyond the fence line, sharp-edged and fresh, pointing toward the barn. Silas Vane had made another mistake. He had assumed that a cattle rancher on the far edge of Wyoming territory would need a week to decide whether to fight or fold. He hadn't known that the man he was dealing with had spent a decade learning that wars were won by those who began preparing before the first shot was fired. The clock on the kitchen wall ticked toward midnight. 20 miles south in the post town of Creston, a mail clerk named Olin sat above his post office with a ledger open on his desk and a lamp burning low, unaware that by morning he would have a visitor who had very specific questions and very specific leverage and no intention of leaving without answers. Everett Kane had built this ranch from nothing, from bare ground and stubborn will, and no man alive was going to take it from him. And no man, not Silas Vane, not his hired guns, not his purchased judges, was going to take his wife. He checked his revolver one final time, holstered it, and stood. Get your riding boots, he told Nora quietly. I'm going to Creston tonight. And Nora pulled on her riding boots without argument, though her hands fumbled slightly with the laces, and she had to start over twice before her fingers cooperated. The bruising along her jaw had stiffened during the hour they'd spent talking, and every movement pulled at tender muscle. She didn't complain about it. Everett noticed, said nothing, and quietly went to the medicine cabinet to retrieve the small tin of arnica salve his previous housekeeper had left behind. He set it on the table beside her. After, he said, when we get back. She looked at the tin, then at him. You keep a tidy medicine cabinet for a man who lives alone. Lived alone, he corrected, and ranching is hard work. Things break. It wasn't a tender moment exactly, but something passed between them, in it some small, ordinary acknowledgement that they were still two people trying to build a life together, even in the middle of everything trying to tear it apart. Nora tucked the tin into her coat pocket without being asked, and Everett turned back to his preparations. He rolled the betrothal receipt into the leather satchel he used for cattle paperwork, along with the notes Nora had written. He added the blank document he'd been drafting in his head for the last 20 minutes, written out now in his own clean hand, a framework for a sworn statement, the kind of thing a federal clerk would recognize as legally binding. He'd written enough dispatch reports in his scouting days to know the language. Nora watched him work. You think he'll just sign it, this Olin? I think he'll be given a very clear picture of his alternatives. What are his alternatives? Sign the statement or be arrested for federal mail fraud. Everett snapped the satchel closed. Most men prefer the option that doesn't involve prison. Silas isn't most men. Silas isn't the one I'm going to see tonight. He looked at her. Olin is. Olin is exactly most men, is small, nervous, motivated by money, and afraid of consequences. He sold you out for $200 in a promise that no one would ever know. The moment someone credible tells him that promise is already broken, he'll fold. They rode out at midnight. Everett extinguished all the lamps first, leaving the ranch house dark as he'd found it when he'd built it, just another shadow in a sea of Wyoming dark. The horses moved quietly through the first mile, hooves muffled by the dry grass still soft from the previous night's rain. Nora rode beside him, not behind. He noticed that too. Some women would have hung back, deferred to the man who knew the roads. She matched his pace and kept her eyes moving across the darkness, the same way his did, not nervously, but systematically. She'd been running long enough to have developed that instinct. "How far is Creston?" she asked. "Hour's ride if we keep steady pace, less if we push." "Do we need to push?" He scanned the horizon. Nothing moved. Not yet. They rode in silence for a while, the kind of silence that wasn't empty, but full, when the prairie breathing around them. The stars sharp and cold overhead, the distant low of cattle, somewhere east in the darkness. Everett found himself thinking about what Nora had said earlier about her father signing the contract. About a man selling his own daughter to pay a debt. "How old were you," he asked, "when your father signed the contract?" Nora was quiet for a moment. 22? "Did you know at the time?" "He told me after it was signed, presented it as a fine arrangement he'd made on my behalf." Her voice was flat, controlled. "Said Silas was a man of standing. Said it was better than I could have managed on my own." "And your mother?" "Had been dead 3 years by then." A pause. She would have stopped him. She was the kind of woman who stopped things. "I got less of that than I should have. I think the stopping instinct. I spent too many years accommodating instead." "You stopped eventually." "I ran. That's not the same thing." She was quiet for another beat. "Running isn't stopping. Running is just delay with better shoes. Stopping is what I'm doing now." She glanced at him sideways. "What we're doing now?" Everett thought about that for a while and didn't disagree with it. Creston came into view just after 1 in the morning. A cluster of dark buildings strung along a single main road, a water tower at the far end catching the moonlight, most of the windows black at this hour. A traveling town, the kind that existed primarily to serve the postal route in the occasional stagecoach stop. Not big enough to have its own marshal. Not small enough to be ignored by the territorial post system. The post office occupied the first floor of a 2-story wooden building near the center of the road. A light burned in the single upper window. Everett tied both horses 2 buildings down behind the feed store, and they approached on foot through the narrow alley between buildings. He went up the outside stairway alone. He told Nora to wait at the base, not because he didn't trust her, but because Olin seeing an unfamiliar woman in the middle of the night might spook him before the conversation had a chance to begin. She'd accepted the logic without argument, though the look on her face made it clear she was filing away her objections for a later date. The stairs creaked under his boots. He didn't try to mask the sound. A man heard you coming. He had less opportunity to do something foolish with the time he had left to himself. He knocked twice. Silence. Then movement inside, the scrape of a chair, the careful creak of someone trying to walk quietly toward the door. "Post office opens at 7, a voice said through the wood, thin, reedy, trying very hard to sound unconcerned. "I'm not here for the post office," Everett said. Another silence. Longer. Then the sound of a bolt being drawn back. The man who opened the door was slight, narrow-shouldered, somewhere in his late 30s, with ink-stained fingers, in the kind of pallor that came from spending too much time in small rooms with insufficient windows. He wore a nightshirt tucked into trousers and his feet were bare. He blinked at Everett with the careful blankness of a man who had learned to control his face around strangers. "Mr. Olin," Everett said, "I'm afraid you have me at a disadvantage." The man's eyes moved quickly, assessing the gun belt, the leather satchel, the expression that wasn't quite threatening and wasn't quite friendly. "I don't believe we've met. My name is Everett Kane. I have a ranch outside Ridgeline." He stepped inside without being invited. "I'm married to a woman you helped a man named Silas Vane track down." All the careful blankness drained out of Olin's face at once. Everett closed the door behind him and looked around the room with the practiced unhurry of a man who had done this kind of thing before. Papers on the desk, an open ledger, columns of figures in careful script. A second door leading to the back office, probably where the actual post records were kept. He noted all of it and turned back to Olin, who had backed up until the desk was behind him and his hands were flat against its surface. "I don't know what you're—" "Yes, you do." Everett set the leather satchel on the desk and opened it. He produced the betrothal receipt, set it down. This document was obtained through your office. Silas Vane paid you to access Continental Marriage Agency placement records. He used that information to locate my wife, travel to my property, and beat her badly enough to close one eye completely. He paused. She's outside right now as it happens. You're welcome to come down and see the bruises if you need a visual reference for the consequences of what you did. Olin's hands were shaking. He said it was a legal matter. He said he had rights. He paid you $200. Everett's voice didn't change inflection. That's not a legal matter. That's a bribe, which makes what you did mail fraud interference with confidential federal correspondence. That's prison time, Mr. Olin. Territorial first, federal second, and federal sentences run longer than territorial ones. I have a family. The words came out as something close to a plea. I have children. You should have thought about that before you sold my wife's location to a man who beats women. Everett set the blank statement on the desk beside the receipt. He placed a pen beside it. Here's your situation. You signed this statement, full account of what Vane paid you, what information you provided when the transaction took place, and I take that statement to a federal judge instead of a federal marshal. You testify when required. In return, I will personally advocate for reduced charges, a fine, probation, something that lets you keep your job and go home to your family. And if I don't sign, then I ride to the nearest federal telegraph station in the morning and report a mail fraud scheme to the Denver office. They'll send a marshal within the week. He won't bring a blank statement. He'll bring handcuffs. Olin looked at the document, looked at Everett, looked at the document again. How do I know you'll keep your word? You don't. Everett met his eyes. But you know what Silas Vane keeps his word about because you've seen it. You brokered the introduction that put him back in contact with my wife. You know what he does when someone helps him and then becomes inconvenient. He let that settle. I'm offering you a better risk than he is. Olin sat. He picked up the pen. His hand moved. He wrote for 11 minutes, slow shaking, at first steadier as it went on. Names, dates, amounts, a detailed account of the transaction, and exactly what records he had accessed and transmitted. When he finished, he set down the pen and pushed the document across the desk. Everett read it carefully before folding it into the satchel. One more thing, and he said, has Vane contacted you since the initial transaction? Once, Olin rubbed his face with both hands. 3 days ago, sent a man to ask if anyone had come asking questions. I said no. And when that man comes back, he said he'd send word when the matter was resolved. Olin's expression made clear exactly what resolution Silas had in mind. I think he meant when he had her back. Everett stood. He picked up the satchel. He looked at Olin for one more moment, a small, frightened man in a barefooted nightshirt who had made a poor decision for $200 and was now living inside its consequences. If Vane contacts you again, Everett said quietly, you tell me, you send word to the Ridgeline General Store, ask for my name. The man there knows me. He moved toward the door. If you warn Vane instead, if you tell him someone came asking questions, I will make certain that the federal marshal knows about every transaction in that ledger, not just the one involving my wife. Olin said nothing, but his eyes moved involuntarily to the ledger on the desk, and Everett saw it and Olin saw him see it. Good night, Everett said. He descended the stairs without hurrying. Nora was exactly where he'd left her, standing against the feed store wall with her arms crossed and her eyes scanning the road in both directions. When she heard his boots on the stairs, she straightened. He signed, she said, not a question. He signed. She fell into step beside him as they moved toward the horses. What did he say about Silas? Confirmed the bribe, confirmed what he transmitted, and confirmed that Vane is still running surveillance. He had someone check on Olin 3 days ago, making sure the cover story was holding. Everett untied his horse and swung into the saddle. Which means Silas doesn't know we know yet. That's an advantage. A small one. The only kind worth having in my experience. They rode back through the darkness, and the stars were the same stars they'd been an hour ago, cold and indifferent and absolutely everywhere. But the satchel on Everett's saddle was heavier now, heavier with the weight of something documented, something provable, something that existed now in ink and signature, rather than only in fear and memory. It wasn't everything. It wasn't nearly enough on its own, but it was the first thread. They were 2 miles from the ranch when Nora spoke again quietly into the darkness between them. When I wrote to the agency, she said I told them I wanted someone honest, someone who did what they said they were going to do. She paused. Most people in my experience say things and then find reasons not to do them. I had started to believe that was just how people were. Everett didn't answer immediately. The ranch lights appeared in the distance. He'd left the barn lamp burning enough to guide them home without drawing attention. I don't say things I'm not going to do, he said finally. It's a waste of time. I know that now. Another silence, then quietly, I'm sorry I didn't trust you sooner. You trusted me enough. He guided his horse through the gate. You're still here. They were putting the horses away when it happened. Everett heard it first, the shift in his horse's breathing, the slight forward press of ears that meant something outside the ordinary had entered its awareness. He set down the saddle he was hanging and stood very still. Listened. Hoofbeats. Not far. Moving slowly, the particular careful gait of horses being ridden by people trying not to be heard. He turned. Nora was looking at him, had seen the change in his posture, was already moving toward the rifle he'd left propped against the barn wall. How many? She whispered. He held up 2 fingers, then 3. He wasn't certain. He pointed to the back corner of the barn, the deep shadow behind the feed bins, the place where the lamp's reach didn't extend. She moved there without argument. He took up a position beside the barn door, his back to the wall, the revolver in his hand. He waited. The hoofbeats slowed, further stopped somewhere beyond the fence line. A minute passed in absolute silence. Then the barn door swung wider on its hinges. 3 men stepped inside. They moved the way men moved when they were confident of their advantage, spread out easy, the casual arrogance of people accustomed to outnumbering their opposition. The one in front was the tallest, wide-shouldered, a hat pushed back from a face that had broken a nose at least once. He scanned the barn in a single practice sweep. Came, he said, not a question, an announcement. Everett cocked the revolver. The sound in the confined space was very clear. You're in my barn, he said. The tall man stopped moving. The other 2 spread slightly wider, and Everett tracked them in his peripheral vision, a hand near a gun belt, another man's weight shifting forward. Easy now, the tall man said. He raised his hands slightly, showing palms. Just here to talk. People who want to talk knock on the front door. Maybe we thought you'd prefer privacy. The man smiled. It didn't reach anything above his jaw. Mr. Vane sends his regards. Says he'd like you to reconsider his offer. 1 week was generous. He's prepared to be even more generous. Cash payment. You dissolve the marriage. You keep your ranch. Everyone goes home happy. Except my wife. Mr. Vane's betrothed. The correction was smooth practiced. Who made certain commitments that she's currently failing to honor. 2 against 1, Everett said. He heard it then, the particular quality of silence from the back corner. Too particular. Too deliberate. Might want to count again. I can count, Nora said. She stepped out from the shadow with the rifle raised and her eye along the sight, and the firelight caught her face, bruised, steady, frightened and fighting it, and Everett saw the tall man's smile finally stop pretending. Mrs. Kane, he said carefully. Not Vane's betrothed, she said. Kane's wife. There's a difference. Her hands were steady. Tell your employer that the next time he wants to send a message to this property, he can send it by post. We have an arrangement with the Creston post office. She paused. A very detailed one as of tonight. The 3 men exchanged a glance, quick, calculating the kind of silent conference that men conduct when they've just realized a situation has changed without their noticing. You'll want to leave now, Everett said. All 3 of you. And you'll want to tell Silas Vane that his deadline doesn't apply to people who've already started building a case against him. He kept the revolver level. And that the next men he sends to this property at night won't be walking back out to deliver their report. A long moment, nobody moved. Then the tall man lowered his hand slowly and took a step backward. The other 2 followed. They went out the barn door in the same careful order they'd come in, spread out watching over their shoulders, the confidence replaced by something more calculated. The hoofbeats faded into darkness, then silence. Nora lowered the rifle. Her arms were shaking now, delayed reaction, the adrenaline finding its way out through her hands. Everett holstered his revolver and crossed to her and put a hand on her shoulder, a brief, solid contact, nothing more than that. You didn't hesitate, he said. I nearly did, she admitted. But you didn't. He took the rifle from her and set it carefully against the post. That's the part that matters. She looked at him for a moment in the lamplight, and there was something in her face that hadn't been there that morning. Not hope this time. Something harder and more durable than hope. Something that looked in the warm and unsteady light like the beginning of resolve. Tomorrow we go to Cheyenne, she said. We take Olin's statement to the federal judge. Tomorrow, he agreed. But first, He reached into her coat pocket and retrieved the arnica tin he'd put there before they'd left. He pressed it into her hands. You said after. It's after. She looked down at the tin. Then she laughed, a short, exhausted sound that wasn't entirely humor and wasn't entirely grief, but was somehow both at once. Outside, Wyoming spread its vast and indifferent dark in every direction. Somewhere in it, 3 men were riding back to report to Silas Vane that his cattle rancher hadn't folded. And in a post town 20 miles south, a clerk named Olin sat at his desk with ink-stained fingers in a signed confession that now existed in 2 copies, one in a leather satchel and one that Everett had quietly left with the feed store owner in Creston, sealed and addressed to the Federal Telegraph Office in Denver to be mailed in exactly 48 hours, unless Everett came back to collect it personally. A precaution. The kind of precaution that men learned to take when they'd spent 11 years understanding how quickly things could go wrong in the dark. The clock in the ranch house ticked toward 2 in the morning. They had less than a week. They had 1 confession, 1 receipt, 1 woman who had stopped running, and a man who had never learned how. It would have to be enough to start. They left for Cheyenne at sunset the following day. Everett had spent the daylight hours doing what needed doing, feeding cattle, mending a broken section of fence along the north pasture, looking for all the world like a rancher who had nothing more pressing on his mind than the ordinary maintenance of his land. Nora had watched him from the kitchen window and understood the performance for what it was. If Vane's men were still watching the property from a distance, they would see nothing alarming. A man going about his work, a woman in her kitchen. What they wouldn't see was the leather satchel packed and ready inside the cedar chest, or the fresh ammunition counted out and distributed between 2 gun belts and a rifle scabbard, or the route Everett had traced 3 times on the marked maps before folding them into his coat pocket. She had spent the day writing, not the notes he'd asked for, those were already done. She wrote something else, a full account in her own hand of everything that had happened from the moment her father had come home from one of his meetings with Silas Vane and told her she was going to be married, every conversation she could remember, every detail of the betrothal agreement as her father had described it, the names of the witnesses, the notary's seal, which she could still picture clearly, an oval stamp with a date inside it, and a man's initials she had memorized because she'd known even then that something wasn't right about the ceremony being witnessed by Silas's own solicitor rather than an independent party. She wrote about the woman in Silas's household, the dish, the beating she had watched from a doorway that she hadn't been supposed to be standing in. She wrote about the week before the ceremony when she had contacted the Continental Marriage Agency under her mother's name, Nora Ellswood, and paid the registration fee with coins she'd been saving for 3 years in a small tin hidden in the lining of a winter coat. She wrote it all, 10 pages front and back in her careful schoolteacher's hand. When Everett came in from the last of the afternoon chores, he found the pages on the kitchen table weighted by the salt cellar. He read them standing up, not sitting. He read slowly. When he was finished, he looked at her for a moment without speaking. "This is good," he said finally. "It's true. That's what makes it good." He tucked the pages into the satchel with Olin's confession and the betrothal receipt. He tightened the straps. They rode out as the sun dropped behind the western ridge, and the sky went the particular color it went in that country when the day was ending, not soft exactly, but immense, like the inside of something too large to comprehend. Nora had learned to love that sky in 6 months of living beneath it. She hadn't expected to. She'd grown up under Missouri's smaller tree-crowded horizon, and the openness of Wyoming had frightened her at first. Too much space, too little concealment. Now the openness felt like breathing. They kept off the main road. Everett knew every alternate trail across this stretch of territory, had ridden them in his scouting years before he'd ever staked his claim, and he moved through the dark country with the unhurried confidence of someone navigating familiar rooms. Nora followed his line and kept her eyes on the ridge lines the way he'd shown her. For 2 hours, nothing. Then the sound of hoofbeats behind them. Not gaining, not falling back, just present. Maintaining distance. Everett raised his hand and they slowed together. "We're being followed," Nora said low. "Have been for about 20 minutes. He didn't look back. Single rider, keeping a quarter mile, not trying to close on us. Reporting our position, most likely." He thought for a moment. "It changes some things." "Changes how?" "We can't ride straight to the courthouse. If he knows where we're going, then Silas will have men there before we arrive." She understood. "So we don't go to the courthouse first." "That was my thought," he said. "We go to the hotel, come in the back, rest the horses. Then you find Judge Merritt, separately bring him to us instead of the other way around. He looked at her. You mentioned him last fall when you came back from the cattle auction, she said. You said you'd run into a man from your scouting days who'd become a judge. You said he was the most honest man in 3 territories. Benjamin Merritt. He was quiet for a moment. You remember that? I listen to the things you say, Everett, even when you think you're just talking. He folded his map. Then we go to the hotel. They veered south at the next fork and cut through the Harlan Basin, coming out on the east side of Cheyenne well before dawn. Behind them, the trailing rider chose the main road and kept going. They arrived unannounced and unseen, stabled the horses behind Mrs. Hargrove's boarding house on Caldwell Street, and took a room on the 2nd floor. Nora slept for 3 hours. Real sleep, deep and sudden, the kind that came when a body finally permitted itself. Rest it had been denying for days. She woke to gray morning light and Everett sitting at the room's small table with a cup of coffee and one of his maps spread in front of him, making small notations in pencil. You didn't sleep, she said. I'll sleep after. He didn't look up. Merritt holds morning sessions at the courthouse starting at 8. I know where his clerk's office is. I'll go while the courthouse is still opening up less attention. You stay here. You keep saying that, and you keep ignoring it, because it's better when I'm there. She sat up, pushed her hair back. The bruising had yellowed at the edges, now the color shifting from purple toward the sickly brown-green of a week-old wound. It looked worse in morning light than it had in lamplight. She could feel him registering it from across the room. Don't look at me like that. Like what? Like you're calculating what Silas Vane owes you. He looked back at his map. I'm going to Merritt alone first. If he agrees to see us, I'll come back for you. That's not keeping you out of it, that's managing the sequence. She considered this. 75 minutes, she said. If you're not back in 75 minutes, I'm coming to find you. He folded the map. Fine. He was back in 50. His expression when he came through the door told her 2 things simultaneously, that he had found Merritt and that something had complicated whatever conversation they'd had. Tell me, she said. He sat. Merritt will see us. He cleared his morning schedule when I showed him the confession. He set his hat on the table, but Silas is already here. The air in the small room changed. He arrived last night, Everett continued. According to Merritt's clerk, Vane sent word ahead requesting a private meeting with the judge. Merritt refused. But the point is he anticipated us. He knew this was where we'd come. He guessed, Nora said, or his rider got ahead of us somehow. Either way, he's here and he knows this is where we'd go. Everett leaned forward. Merritt wants to see us immediately before Vane can establish any formal legal presence. But getting to the courthouse without being spotted is the problem. I know the back way, she said. He stopped. Mrs. Hargrove told me while you were gone. There's an alley through the milliner's block and out behind the feed exchange on the east side. She picked up her coat. She uses it when the women from the house don't want to be seen by creditors. He looked at her for a moment with the expression she'd come to recognize, the one that said he was recalculating something about her. You talked to Mrs. Hargrove, he said. Briefly. She used to run a house in Red Hollow. She knows who Silas Vane is. Said he had a merchant killed there 3 years ago, a man who refused to sell his building. Nora buttoned her coat. She said it like it was just a fact, just something that happened. That's how far his reach goes. They went through the milliner's alley. Judge Benjamin Merritt was a spare man in his 60s with close-cropped, white hair and the kind of posture that came from decades of believing that how you held yourself communicated something important about who you were. He received them in his private chambers, a book-lined room that smelled of wood polish and old as paper, and he read every document they had brought while they sat across from his desk and waited. He read without expression. He read everything, Olin's confession, the betrothal receipt, Nora's 10 pages of personal testimony, the copy of the original agency records showing the placement under her mother's name. When he finished, he looked at Nora directly. Mrs. Kane, he said, I want to ask you something and I want you to answer without considering what answer you think I want to hear. All right, she said. Were you coerced into your current marriage? Were you deceived or pressured in any way? No. She held his gaze. I entered it willingly and with full knowledge of what I was choosing. The deception was mine. I didn't tell my husband the full circumstances before we married. That was a choice I made out of fear, not out of anything he did. Merritt nodded slowly. And you chose to stay, after your husband learned the truth. I chose to stay, she said. I intend to keep choosing it. Merritt looked at Everett. And you, no reservations about the marriage? No desire to dissolve it on the grounds of her prior concealment? None. Everett's voice was flat and certain. The only thing I want dissolved is Vane's claim on my wife, which was based on coercion and a fraudulent contract from the start. Merritt picked up Olin's confession and examined it again. This is enough to open a federal inquiry, he said. Mail fraud involving corruption of federal postal employees is squarely within my jurisdiction. Olin's statement names Vane, explicitly documents the transaction with dates and amounts, and establishes a clear chain of culpability. He set it down. What I cannot do, not yet not on the basis of this alone, is invalidate the betrothal contract itself. Nora's stomach dropped. The contract predates your current marriage, Merritt continued. It was witnessed and notarized. The question of your father's duress requires a separate proceeding to adjudicate. It's not a matter I can resolve this morning. So it's still valid, Everett said. Until a court rules otherwise, yes. In its current legal standing. Merritt held up a hand. However, what I can do this morning is issue an emergency federal protection order forbidding Silas Vane or any person acting on his behalf from approaching either of you or from making any attempt to enforce the betrothal agreement pending the outcome of the fraud inquiry. Will it stop him? Nora asked. Merritt's expression was honest. It will give me legal grounds to arrest him if he doesn't stop. That's different from stopping him. He began to write. I'm also telegraphing the federal marshal's office in Denver this morning. I want a marshal assigned to this inquiry within the week. He worked quickly. 3 copies of the protection order, 1 for Everett, 1 for the marshal's file, 1 to be posted at the sheriff's office. One thing you should know, he said without looking up. Vane arrived last night and has been asking questions this morning. His attorney filed a motion in territorial court first thing today, attempting to establish the betrothal contract's validity before any federal inquiry could be opened. He blotted the last page. I've already moved to stay that filing. He knew we were coming, Everett said. He guessed you were coming, Merritt said, which means he's afraid. He looked up. Powerful men don't scramble like this when they're confident. They wait. They let the machinery work for them. Vane is moving fast, making noise trying to get ahead of something. Whatever you did before you came here, whatever information you secured, it has rattled him. He handed the protection order across the desk. Stay alive. I mean that practically. He's been operating for 15 years by making problems disappear. You are now a problem he cannot make disappear through his usual means. That makes you more dangerous to him than you may realize, and him more dangerous to you than he was before. They left through the milliner's alley again. They were halfway back to the boarding house when Nora stopped. She had seen him before. Everett had a figure leaning against the post of a dry goods store on the far side of the street, watching them with a particular quality of stillness that wasn't casual. A broad man in a good coat, gray at the temples, a face she had spent 2 years trying to forget. Silas Vane looked at her across the width of the Cheyenne Street, and he smiled. Not the cold smile she remembered from Missouri. Something worse deliberate, communicating very clearly that he knew exactly where they were, had known for some time, and that this particular encounter was entirely intentional. He had 2 men with him, one on either side, both armed, both watching Everett with the careful attention of professionals. The street was not empty. People moved along the boardwalks, going about the ordinary business of a frontier morning. A wagon passed between them, briefly blocking the sightline. Everett's hand didn't go to his gun. Instead, it went to her arm, a light steadying contact. Don't stop walking, he said quietly. Don't look at him again. He knows we went to Merritt. Yes. The protection order is ink on paper if he doesn't care about being arrested. Yes. He kept them moving. But he's in the street in broad daylight in front of witnesses. He's not going to move against us here. Then why show himself at all? To make sure you know he can find you, Everett said. To show you that a federal judge's order doesn't change what he's capable of. To give you a chance to get frightened enough to make a mistake. He guided them around a corner. That's how he works. He doesn't always come at you directly. Sometimes he just makes sure you know he's there. I know he's there, Nora said. I know. He's going to try tonight, she said. Not in daylight, not with a protection order on file and federal eyes on him. But tonight, when the street's empty, that's when it happens. That's when it has always happened with him. Everett said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. They reached the boarding house. Mrs. Hargrove was in the parlor, and she looked up when they came in and asked no questions, simply went to the kitchen and returned with 2 cups of coffee and a look that conveyed more than a speech would have. Everett produced a card from his coat pocket and set it on the table. small, cream-colored. A name written in ink. Sisters of the Sacred Heart, 14 Gallatin Street. Inquire for Sister Agnes. Merritt's idea, she asked. He said they take in women who need shelter. Said Vane's men won't touch church property in the middle of a federal inquiry, too visible, too many witnesses, and it transforms a mail fraud case into something much worse for everyone involved. He looked at her. He also said you'd be safer there tonight than anywhere else in the city. And you? Merritt offered me a room at his own house. Nora held the card for a moment. I don't like being separated from you. I don't like it either, but it's right. For tonight. His voice was certain. Tomorrow morning we're back together back at the courthouse. Once the federal marshal's office is officially engaged, Vane's window for direct action closes significantly. She stood. All right, she said, Gallatin Street. She picked up the satchel before she picked up anything else. The one with the evidence. Everything they'd built. Some things you carried with you everywhere, because some things couldn't afford to be anywhere you weren't. Outside, Cheyenne went about its morning raw-edged and ambitious. Somewhere in this city, Silas Vane was making calculations in a hotel room or a private house. She could feel it, the particular quality of being watched, of being measured, of someone running numbers against outcomes. She had lived with that feeling for 2 years, and she recognized it the way you recognize the smell of a storm before it arrived. He was going to move tonight, which meant tonight was the most important night to be somewhere unmovable. She followed Everett out into the street, and the cold morning air hit her bruised face, and she thought about her mother, the kind of woman who stopped things, and thought that perhaps she had inherited more of that than she'd ever believed. She was going to find out soon enough. The Sisters of the Sacred Heart occupied a stone building on Gallatin Street, 3 stories tall, and built to last, the kind of structure that communicated permanence, which was exactly the point. Sister Agnes was a small, practical woman in her 50s who heard Nora's situation in 3 sentences, asked 2 clarifying questions, and showed her to a clean room on the 2nd floor without ceremony. You'll be safe here, she said simply, and the simplicity of it, offered as fact rather than reassurance, made it feel more credible than any elaborate promise could have. I know, Nora said. She sat on the edge of the narrow bed and listened to the building settle around her, the sound of other women moving through the quarters, the distant clatter of a kitchen being organized for the evening meal, the particular quality of quiet that came from stone walls and conviction. She opened the satchel. She read through every document again. Olin's confession, the betrothal receipt, her own 10 pages, the federal protection order with Merritt's signature and seal. She read them the way you read a map before a difficult journey, not because you've forgotten where you're going, but because you want to make certain you haven't missed anything. She hadn't missed anything, but there was still a gap, still the central problem that Merritt had identified: the contract itself, witnessed, notarized, signed by her father with the particular kind of authority that courts recognized. Until it was legally invalidated, it existed as a counterclaim against everything they'd built. Silas knew this. It was why he hadn't run. It was why he was still here, still maneuvering, still showing himself on streets in broad daylight instead of cutting his losses and retreating to Missouri. He had one card that nothing else could immediately override, and he intended to play it. Nora thought about the notary seal, the initials inside the oval stamp, the fact that the witness to the contract had been Vane's own solicitor rather than any independent party. She had a schoolteacher's memory and a frightened woman's habit of cataloging details. She reached into the satchel and took out the betrothal receipt, the copy, not the one Merritt had filed. She held it under the lamp and looked at the notary seal closely, studied the initials. GW. She had seen those initials somewhere else. She sat very still for a moment, reaching back through memory. HWP. She had seen them on a piece of correspondence in her father's study the week after the contract was signed. A letter she had found accidentally written from Vane's solicitor to her father, referencing a secondary agreement, something about the transfer of her father's remaining debt. The letter had been written on professional stationery with an embossed seal in the corner. The same initials. The notary who had witnessed the betrothal contract was Vane's own solicitor. Not an independent party, not a neutral witness. A man in Silas Vane's direct employ, certifying a document that benefited his employer. That wasn't a notary. That was a party to the contract, certifying itself. She picked up her pen and began writing again, a separate page detailing exactly what she remembered. The letter, the initials, the specific connection between the notary seal and Vane's personal legal representation. It might be enough. It might be the thing that made the contract voidable, not just contested. She wrote until the building went quiet around her and the lamp burned low, and outside on Gallatin Street, the city went dark, and somewhere across the city, Silas Vane was making his calculations. But so was she, and she was no longer making them afraid. The night passed without incident at the Sisters of the Sacred Heart, which was either reassuring or a different kind of warning. Nora couldn't decide which. She woke twice, once at midnight and once just before 4 in the morning, and lay still in the narrow bed listening to the stone building breathe around her. Nothing moved on Gallatin Street except the wind and a loose shutter on a building 2 doors down that knocked with steady, harmless regularity. She thought about Everett across the city at Merritt's house. She thought about Silas in whatever room he'd taken, running his calculations, ticking off options. The way men like him always ticked off options, not as moral questions, never as moral questions, just as logistics. What was available? What was useful? What could be made to disappear? She thought about the notary seal. HWP, Hervey Wentworth Pruitt. She had remembered the full name sometime around 3 in the morning, surfaced from the same frightened woman's memory that had cataloged it years ago and filed it under things that felt wrong about that day. Hervey Wentworth Pruitt, who practiced law out of an office on Mercantile Street in Kansas City, who had been Silas Vane's personal attorney for at least 6 years, that she knew of, who had been the only official witness to a contract that required an independent notary. It was fraud, not the same fraud as Olin's, something older, more fundamental. The kind of fraud that happened at the root of a thing and made everything grown from it suspect. She had written 7 pages of it by the time morning came through the high window. Sister Agnes brought her breakfast without being asked. Bread, coffee, a hard-boiled egg that she ate standing at the window, looking down at Gallatin Street in the early light. The street was waking up the way streets did incrementally, delivery wagons and early risers, and a dog investigating something near the corner with focused professional interest. No sign of Vane's men, but absence of evidence wasn't evidence of absence, and she knew that. Everett arrived at 8:15 on foot, coming down Gallatin Street with a satchel over one shoulder and the particular quality of movement that told her he'd been awake all night too. She met him in the small receiving room on the ground floor, and Sister Agnes appeared briefly in the doorway, assessed the situation with the practiced eye of a woman who had seen a great deal of human difficulty, and withdrew without comment. "How was Merritt's house?" Nora asked. "Quiet, clean. He has a very good cook." He looked at her. "You found something." It wasn't a question. He could read her the way she read him, months of careful observation accumulating into something that functioned like fluency. "Sit down," she said. "I need to show you." She spread the pages on the table. She explained the notary seal, the initials, the letter she had found in her father's study, the name Hervey Wentworth Pruitt, and his documented relationship to Silas Vane. She went through it systematically, without rushing, the way she'd organized it in her own mind during the long hours of the night. Everett read what she'd written. He asked 2 questions, both precise, both focused on verifiability. Did she still have the letter, Mum? It had been in her father's house, which Vane had certainly cleared after her disappearance. Could she identify the stationery firm or any other detail that could be independently corroborated? Possibly the letterhead had included an address, and she had memorized it the same way she'd memorized everything else about that terrible week. He took her new pages and folded them into the satchel with everything else. "This is significant," he said. "I think so. Merritt needs to see this before we go to the courthouse." "I know." They sent word to Merritt through his clerk, a brief note delivered by one of the sisters' regular errand boys, a practical arrangement that Sister Agnes facilitated without being asked, evidently accustomed to being a note in networks that required discretion. Merritt came to them. He arrived at the Sisters of the Sacred Heart at 9:30 in the morning, alone on foot, without his judicial robes and wearing a coat that made him look like a private citizen. He read Nora's new pages in the same focused silence with which he'd read everything else. When he looked up, something had changed in his expression. Not excitement, he was too controlled a man for that, but a kind of focused intensity that was its own form of urgency. "You're certain about this name," he said. "Hervey Wentworth Pruitt." "Completely. And you can describe the letterhead stationery in enough detail that it could be independently identified." The firm was called Pruitt Holloway and Associates. The address was listed as 412 Mercantile Street in Kansas City. The letterhead was printed in dark blue ink on cream stock. There was a small embossed device in the upper left corner, what I think was a set of scales. She paused. "I'm a school teacher, Judge. I read things carefully, and I remember what I read. Merritt set down the pages. He looked at Everett. This changes the inquiry significantly, he said. If the notarizing party was in fact Vane's own attorney, a direct party to the transaction, then the contract was never properly witnessed. It's procedurally void, not contested, not disputable, not subject to lengthy adjudication. He paused. Void, as in it was never legally executed in the first place. The room was very quiet. You can verify this, Everett asked. I can subpoena Pruitt's professional records, bar association registration, client lists. If Vane is on that list, and given what Mrs. Kane has described, he will be, then the contract is invalidated on its face. Merritt stood. I need to do this from my chambers. Today, before Vane's attorney files anything else in territorial court. He picked up his coat. Come with me. Both of you, stay close and don't stop moving. They walked to the courthouse the long way through the back streets Nora had learned from Mrs. Hargrove. Merritt moved quickly for a man his age with the unhurried efficiency of someone who had learned that deliberate pace and urgency were not mutually exclusive. They were 2 blocks from the courthouse when the trouble began. Not Vane himself, he was too careful for that, too aware of the protection order's implications. It was 2 men who stepped out of the alley entrance to their left, positioned with the particular deliberateness of people who had been waiting rather than arriving. Both were large. Both wore coats that hung wrong in the way coats hung when they were covering a substantial amount of hardware. Neither of them was reaching for a weapon. Not yet. Judge Merritt, the taller one said. Polite, almost pleasant. Mr. Vane would like a word. Mr. Vane can address me through the proper channels, Merritt said without breaking stride. He thought maybe an informal conversation first. The man shifted position, not quite blocking the sidewalk, but making the path narrower. Save everyone some time. Move, Everett said. The man looked at him, assessing. You're the rancher. I'm the man who's going to the courthouse with a federal judge and a protection order which makes whatever you're thinking about doing it approximately the worst decision you'll make today. Everett's voice was level. No raised volume, no theatrical menace, just the flat certainty of a man stating facts. Move. A long moment. The second man had his hand near his coat, fingers flexed. Nora had her hand inside her own coat, fingers closed around the small pistol she had put there that morning, a Derringer 2-shots borrowed from Sister Agnes's desk drawer with a quiet permission. Agnes had pressed it on her without being asked, along with a look that conveyed a great deal of experience with exactly this kind of situation. She didn't draw it, not yet. The tall man looked at Merritt, at Everett, at Nora. He was calculating, she could see it calculating exactly what the cost-benefit looked like on interfering with a federal judge on a public street in broad daylight with witnesses beginning to accumulate on the far side of the road. He stepped aside. Mr. Vane's patience has limits, he said as they passed. So does mine, Merritt said without looking at him. Tell him his attorney will be receiving a subpoena this afternoon. They reached the courthouse without further incident. Inside Merritt's chambers, the next 3 hours were a different kind of fight. Paperwork depositions, official communications dispatched through proper channels, and duplicate copies filed with redundancy that made any single interception meaningless. Merritt moved through it with the systematic efficiency of a man who had been building legal structures for 23 years and knew exactly which joints to reinforce. The telegraph to Denver went out at 11:15. The subpoena for Hervey Wentworth Pruitt's client records went through official channels at noon. The formal motion to void the betrothal contract on grounds of improper notarization was filed at 12:40. At 1 in the afternoon, Merritt's clerk knocked on the chamber door and entered with a message. He handed it to Merritt, who read it and set it on the desk. Vane's attorney has withdrawn the territorial court filing, Merritt said. Nora and Everett both looked at him. An hour ago, Merritt continued, before the subpoena reached them, interestingly, which suggests either a remarkable coincidence or that someone in Vane's camp has become aware that the ground has shifted. He looked at them steadily. It also suggests they may be considering a change in strategy. What kind of change? Everett asked. Merritt's expression was careful. Away from legal channels, which in my experience is what men like Vane do when the law stops working for them. The afternoon light through the courthouse windows cast long angles across the papers on the desk. Nora looked at the stacked documents, at everything they built, at the evidence and the testimony, and the judicial filings, all of it solid and real and legally established. And she thought about what Merritt had just said. Away from legal channels. She thought about the calculations Silas had been running since last night, ticking through options like a man counting coins. Legal routes closing one by one. Federal inquiry opening. His own attorney suddenly exposed. Every institutional tool he'd relied on for 15 years becoming unreliable. What did a man like that do when everything reliable was stripped away? He went back to what had worked before everything else, before the contracts and the judges and the territorial connections. He went back to fear. "We can't stay in Cheyenne tonight," she said. Both men looked at her. "He's pulling back from the legal fight because he's going to try something else," she said. "Tonight, in the city, where he still has men and we're still visible." She looked at Everett. "We need to move before dark." Merritt leaned back in his chair. "Where will you go?" Everett was already thinking. She could see it, the quiet, systematic working through that was his version of urgent. He looked at Merritt. "Is there a federal marshal currently in the territory not in Denver, here in Wyoming?" "There's a deputy marshal stationed in Laramie," Merritt said. "Man named Calvert. Solid. He'd be within his authority to provide escort given the open inquiry." "How quickly can you reach him?" "I can send a rider within the hour." "Then send one." Everett stood. "We'll leave Cheyenne tonight East Road and rendezvous with Calvert en route to Laramie. From Laramie, we go back to Ridgeline with federal escort." He looked at Nora. "Vane can't follow us all the way home with a deputy marshal riding alongside." "And after," she asked. After we get home, we wait for the Denver marshals and let the inquiry do what Merritt built it to do." His voice was certain. "We've done our part. We've built the case. Now we let the law finish it." She looked at him. She thought about the 2 years she'd spent running, about the way she'd felt that morning, waking up in the sister's narrow bed, listening to the building breathe around her, and knowing somewhere across the city, a man was calculating how to unmake her life. She was done being the one who ran while other people calculated. "There's one more thing," she said. Everett waited. "Vane is going to move tonight. You've said it. Merritt said it. I've said it." She kept her voice steady. "If we run tonight before he moves, we get home safe, but he's still here, still free, still in a position to send men to Ridgeline in 6 weeks when the heat from the inquiry dies down and try again. The inquiry takes time," she said. "Merritt said so himself, weeks, maybe months. And Silas has spent 15 years learning how to operate in the space between official actions." She looked at Merritt. "Is there anything that would accelerate the inquiry? Any single piece of evidence that would move it from investigation to active prosecution?" Merritt considered. "A direct confession, documented evidence of an additional crime committed in federal jurisdiction." He paused. "Or a witness who could testify to a specific criminal action beyond what we already have, something that couldn't be explained as contractual dispute." "The burned ranch," Everett said quietly. They both looked at him. "On the road to Cheyenne," he said. "We passed it. Old man sitting in the dirt watching his house burn. Vane's men did it. They told him it was a warning to anyone helping us." Everett's jaw tightened. "That's arson. Federal property crime if it crossed territorial lines. And that ranch sat on surveyed federal land." He looked at Merritt. "Is the man still in the area?" "I have no way of knowing," Merritt said. "I can find out," Nora said. Both men looked at her again. She reached into the satchel and produced the last clean sheet of paper and the pen she'd been carrying since the sisters' building. "Mrs. Hargrove knows everyone in this territory," she said. "She knew about the merchant in Red Hollow. She'll know about a burned ranch on the Cheyenne Road." She was already writing a short note folded addressed. "If anyone knows where that old man went, she does." Merritt looked at the note, looked at Nora. Then he turned to his clerk, who was hovering near the door with the particular alert attentiveness of a man who had realized the afternoon had become considerably more significant than a standard judicial workday. "Hendricks," he said, "I need you to deliver this note to Mrs. Hargrove on Caldwell Street. Now please, quickly." The clerk took the note and moved. The afternoon light shifted. Outside the courthouse, Cheyenne continued its ordinary business, entirely unaware that in a book-lined room on the second floor, a former range scout and a mail-order bride and a federal judge were building something that had started as a desperate escape and was becoming piece by piece something else entirely. Something that looked, in that afternoon light, like a reckoning. Nora looked at the stack of documents on Merritt's desk, at everything they'd built in 36 hours from nothing but evidence and stubbornness, in the particular kind of courage that came not from fearlessness but from being too angry to stop. She thought about her father's study, the letter, the oval seal with its careful initials. She thought about a woman in a household in Missouri who had dropped a dish. She thought about Silas Vane's face across the street that morning, the smile that was meant to communicate reach, meant to communicate inevitability, meant to make her understand that nothing she did would be enough to stop what was coming. She hoped he was watching now. She hoped he understood what he was looking at. Not a woman who had stopped running and was waiting to be caught. A woman who had stopped running and was walking toward him. Merritt's clerk came back in 40 minutes. He brought not just Mrs. Hargrove's answer, but Mrs. Hargrove herself. A sturdy woman in her 50s with iron gray hair and an expression that communicated very clearly that she had decided this situation required her personal involvement and nothing was going to redirect her. She arrived in Merritt's chambers without ceremony, sat in the chair Everett vacated for her, and addressed the judge directly. "The man from the burned ranch," she said. "His name is Walter Osgood. He's been running that property since before Wyoming was a territory. Right now, he's sleeping in the back room of the harness maker on 4th Street because the harness maker is his brother-in-law and had nowhere else to put him." She set her hands in her lap. "His wife and daughter are with him. They got out before the fire took the house." Nora released a breath she hadn't known she was holding. "They're alive. All 3 of them. The wife has a smoke in her lungs, but she'll be all right." Mrs. Hargrove looked at Merritt. "Walter Osgood has been in this territory 40 years. He is not the kind of man who will decline to testify when someone burned his house to the ground in front of his family." Merritt stood. "I need to speak to him this afternoon. I assumed as much, which is why I walked here instead of sending a note." Mrs. Hargrove stood. "I told him to expect a judge. He said, and I am quoting precisely, 'It's about damn time.'" There was a fractional pause in which, if Merritt was capable of something approaching humor, it lived briefly in the corner of his expression. Then he was moving, reaching for his coat, instructing his clerk to prepare the appropriate evidentiary affidavit forms. "Can you bring him here?" Merritt asked Mrs. Hargrove. "I can bring him wherever you like." She looked at Nora and Everett. "And while I'm doing that, you two might consider that Silas Vane has had 2 men watching the front of this courthouse since 10 o'clock this morning. They're sitting in the barber's across the street pretending to read a newspaper. The barber is not happy about it. He told me so when I walked past." The afternoon unfolded with a kind of compressed, relentless momentum that Nora would later think of as the shape of days when everything changes at once. Walter Osgood arrived at the courthouse at 3 o'clock. A lean, weathered man in borrowed clothes with soot still in the creases of his face and eyes that held the particular quality of someone who had watched something irreplaceable burn and was not yet entirely sure how to reconstruct the world around that fact. He brought his wife and his daughter, both quiet, both with the same steady eyes. He sat across from Merritt and gave his testimony without ornament. 6 men. Vane's brand on 2 of the horses, a distinctive V-bar mark he'd seen on Vane's Remuda when the man had come through the territory 2 years ago on a surveying trip. They'd arrived at dusk, demanded to know if he'd seen a couple heading toward Cheyenne on the back roads. When he said no, they said he was lying. When he repeated it, they said a liar's house burned like any other man's. They lit the barn first, then the house, then rode away without hurrying because men who operated with impunity didn't hurry. His wife had gotten their daughter out through the kitchen window. He had stood in the yard and watched 37 years of work become ash. "Will you sign a sworn statement to that effect?" Merritt asked. Walter Osgood looked at him with the expression of a man who has reached the end of accommodation. "Where do you want me to put my name?" The affidavit was completed, witnessed, and filed by 4 o'clock. At 4:15, Merritt's second telegraph of the day went to Denver. Not the measured jurisdictional communication of the morning. This one was shorter, more direct. Federal arson on surveyed land. 3 witnesses. Direct link to named suspect. Request immediate marshal dispatch. At 4:30, an answer came back. Marshal Rideout and deputy departing Laramie tomorrow morning. ETA. Cheyenne day after tomorrow. Merritt set the telegraph response on his desk and looked at it for a moment. 2 days, he said. 2 days is a long time, Everett said. Yes. Merritt looked at them both. Which is why I'm issuing an emergency warrant for Vane's arrest this evening on the arson charge. The betrothal question is still an adjudication. The fraud inquiry is federal, but arson on federal land is something I can act on directly and immediately. He picked up his pen. Once he's in custody, the threat to you is significantly reduced. Nora thought about the 2 men in the barbershop across the street. He has men watching this building. I have a sheriff's deputy who is going to walk out the front door of this courthouse in approximately 20 minutes with an arrest warrant in his hand, Merritt said without looking up from the warrant he was drafting. What happens after that is between him and Vane. He signed the bottom of the page with the deliberate stroke of a man who had written a great many consequential documents, and treated each one as exactly what it was. What happens with you tonight is a different question. We leave the city, Everett said. Now, before the warrant is served, before Vane knows what's coming. The Marshall rideout can meet us on the Laramie Road, Nora said. We don't have to stay in Cheyenne to wait for him. Merritt looked at them. I'd recommend the East Gate. It's the one Vane's men aren't watching. He paused. Mrs. Hargrove has offered, through a somewhat remarkable exercise in logistical improvisation, to lend you 2 horses from her own stable. Apparently hers are faster than the ones you arrived on. She said that, Everett asked. She also said you shouldn't argue about it. Something moved very briefly in Merritt's expression. I wouldn't. They were ready to move within the hour. Nora found herself in Mrs. Hargrove's small yard behind the boarding house, checking the saddle on a chestnut mare, while the afternoon light went amber and long. The horse was better than the one she'd ridden from Ridgeline younger, with more spring in its movement, and a kind eye that she appreciated unreasonably. She patted its neck, and it turned to look at her with the calm acceptance of a well-kept animal. Mrs. Hargrove appeared at the yard gate. You know how to ride hard, she asked. I grew up with horses, Nora said. Good. Mrs. Hargrove leaned against the gate post. I want to tell you something before you go. Nora waited. I ran a boarding house in Red Hollow for 9 years, Mrs. Hargrove said. In that time, I had 4 women come to me, trying to get away from men like Silas Vane, men who had bought them or inherited them or simply decided they were property. She paused. 3 of them ran. They disappeared the way you were planning to, and 2 years later, I'd hear things a rumor from a traveling man, a letter forwarded through 3 intermediaries. They were still running, still looking over their shoulders, still waiting for the knock on the door. And the 4th, Nora asked. The 4th stopped. Mrs. Hargrove met her eyes. She found herself someone who'd stand the line with her, and she stopped, and they fought it out. It was ugly, and it took time, and there was a night I thought it had gone wrong permanently. Her voice didn't change in quality, but something moved behind it. She's in Denver now, runs a dry goods establishment, 3 children, sends me a letter every Christmas. Nora looked at the woman for a moment. I chose right, she said, not asking. You chose right. Mrs. Hargrove pushed off the gatepost. Now ride. They went out the east gate as Merritt had advised, just as the sun reached the horizon and the sky began its remarkable evening performance. The city fell behind them. Ahead, the plains opened up in the way that Nora had come to love, that vast, unobstructed stretch of country that required a different quality of courage than enclosed spaces did the courage of visibility of being entirely seen. Everett rode beside her and said nothing for the first mile. She said nothing either. There was a kind of communication available in silence between 2 people who had learned each other's quality the way it was possible to know without words that the person beside you was thinking hard and not afraid and had made their decision and was riding toward it. She had understood this abstractly before. She felt it concretely now in the synchronization of their pace, in the angle of his attention, in the way his hand rested easy on the reins, even though everything in the situation argued for tension. He trusted the plan. She trusted the plan. That was enough for right now. Tell me about your wife, she said. The first one. She felt him consider whether to answer. Not evasion consideration. The difference between a man who deflected and a man who decided how much of something he could hold while riding fast in the dark. Her name was Clara, he said. She grew up on the Eastern Plains, schoolteacher's daughter. She was very certain about things, the way she thought about the world. He was quiet for a moment. We had 4 years. They were good years. How did she die? Fever. Summer of '73. Another pause. Fast. I was away on a scouting assignment. I came back and she was gone. He looked at the horizon ahead. I sold the original stake I had in the Southern Territory and bought the Ridgeline land because I needed to go somewhere she'd never been. Somewhere I wasn't expecting to see her in the kitchen when I came through the door. Did it help? Eventually. Actually, he glanced at her. Mostly. Nora held that for a moment. Is that why you nearly didn't answer the agency advertisement? I put the notice in 3 times over 2 years, he said. Pulled it each time before it ran. The 4th time, I let it go to press and told myself if someone answered worth answering, I'd write back. He paused. You were the 17th letter. The 17th? 16 letters in 6 months, and not one of them wrote the way you wrote. He kept his eyes on the road ahead. You wrote like you were being honest without knowing whether honesty was going to help you. Most people write like they're hoping for something. I was hoping for something, she said. I know, but it wasn't the first thing out of you. He glanced at her briefly. That was the difference. Darkness came down around them, familiar and enormous. They rode for an hour in near silence, the horses eating up the ground at a steady pace. No sound of pursuit behind them. Either the warrant had occupied Vane's attention or his men were waiting for a different moment. Both possibilities kept Everett's eyes moving at the ridgelines, but his hands were steady on the reins. They were perhaps 8 miles out of Cheyenne when Nora caught it, a flicker of movement on the ridge to their right, gone almost before it registered. She didn't say anything, watched the spot, waited. It came again, not a deer, not the wind in the dry grass. Right ridge, she said quietly, 200 yards. Everett had already seen it. He pulled up gradually, unhurriedly, the way a man stopped when he wanted it to look casual rather than reactive. His hand drifted toward his rifle without quite reaching it. How many? She asked. 2, he said. Maybe 3. They're positioned on the high ground, which means they've been tracking us from above, not following on the road. He thought. They didn't come from Cheyenne. They were already out here, waiting. The ambush had been prepared before the warrant, before Merritt's legal maneuvering, before any of today's activity. Silas Vane had hedged his bets. He sent these men out last night, Nora said, before we even got to Merritt. He covered the road in case the legal route failed. Yes, so we can't outrun them. She assessed the terrain ahead, the road curving slightly north, the ridge running parallel, the flat ground between offering no meaningful cover. And we can't go back. No, she thought. The chestnut mare shifted under her, sensing the change in her posture. The draw, she said, 1/2 mile south. I saw it when we came through this way, before it drops down into the creek bed, comes back up on the west side of the ridge. If we go through the draw, we come out behind their position. He looked at her. I've been looking at your maps for 6 months, she said. I know this ground. Another half-second of the consideration that was his version of trusting her. Then go. They turned south together, off the road, the horses dropping from canter to careful walk as the ground changed under them. The grass was dry and whispered with their passage, but couldn't be helped. The draw opened ahead of them, exactly where she'd said it would, a natural crease in the land deep enough to provide shadow wide enough for the horses to move through single file without difficulty. They went down into it. The creek bed was dry at this season. The horses' hooves on the hard earth made less sound than she'd feared. Above them, on the ridge, she heard nothing, which meant either the men hadn't moved yet, or they were being very quiet about it. She counted paces, estimated distance, watched the slope on the left as it rose toward the ridgeline. Here, she said softly. They dismounted. Everett tied the horses to a scrub oak with enough slack to stand quietly. He pulled the rifle. She pulled the derringer and immediately felt the inadequacy of 2 shots against an unknown number of armed men. Everett looked at her assessment of the derringer and without comment reached inside his saddlebag and produced a second revolver, a spare he'd apparently been carrying without mentioning. He handed it to her. She took it. They went up the slope on foot. The ridgeline came into view above them, a dark line against the still luminous sky. She moved on the soft ground the way she'd learned to move in 6 months of watching him wait forward heel, last no unnecessary sound. He moved beside her with the practiced silence of someone who had done this in worse terrain than Wyoming grassland. They crested the ridge 3 feet from where 2 men were crouching, watching the road below through the darkness. A third man was positioned 10 yards further along, holding the horses. Everett moved first. He covered the distance to the nearest man in 4 steps, fast and silent, and had the rifle barrel against the man's neck before the sound of his movement had registered. Hands, he said. The man went still. The second man started to turn and found Nora's borrowed revolver at his chest. She had never pointed a gun at a person before. Her hands were steady. She was surprised by that, and then she wasn't. She had been making decisions for months, each one harder than the last, and this was just another decision. Just another moment of choosing to hold the line instead of retreating from it. Tell your friend with the horses to come here slowly, she said, with his hands where I can see them. The man looked at her with an assessment that shifted visibly when he read her face. He turned his head fractionally. Dobbs, he said, come up, easy. The third man came. He saw the configuration and stopped moving. Who sent you? Everett said. Neither of the first 2 men answered. You're on federal land, Everett said. Your horses are branded. You are positioned on a road where at this very moment a Cheyenne sheriff's deputy is serving an arrest warrant for the man who employs you. He kept the rifle steady. So you can tell me what I asked, or you can stay very quiet while I reason through the implications of your situation myself. A long moment. The first man said, "We were told to stop you. Bring her back. Turn you around on the road." "Bring her back to where?" Silence. "There's a hotel in Cheyenne," Nora said. She wasn't guessing, she was reading the man's discomfort, the specific hesitation of someone who hadn't expected the person he was supposed to collect to be asking the questions. "Or a private house. He has somewhere prepared." She looked at Everett. "He's been planning to take me since before we got to Merritt." The legal maneuvering was a distraction, a way to keep us occupied and anxious while his real plan operated on a different track, Everett said. "Yes." The third man, Dobbs, made a decision. He turned and ran for the horses. Everett fired once, into the ground 6 inches from the horses' hooves. All 3 animals screamed and bolted. Dobbs, who had been reaching for the nearest bridle, stumbled backward and sat down hard in the grass. Silence. Then the distant sound of 3 riderless horses making their opinions known as they moved away into the dark. "Now you're on foot," Everett said, "which gives you approximately one option. You walk back to Cheyenne and turn yourself in to the sheriff's office, where Vane's arrest warrant is either already executed or in process, which means you can be first in line to offer testimony in exchange for consideration." He stepped back from the first man. "Or you try something else and we have a longer conversation." Nobody tried anything else. They left the 3 men sitting on the ridge and went back down to the horses. Nora untied the chestnut mare with hands that were, she noticed, finally shaking the delayed response that came every time, the body's honest accounting of what the mind had elected to not register until the moment was past. She tightened the reins and didn't say anything about it. Everett caught her expression. He didn't comment on the shaking either. He swung back into the saddle and looked at the road. "The warrant may not have reached him yet," he said. "He could still be operating. Then we need to move faster than his next instruction. The Marshal Station in Laramie. 12 miles, she said, maybe 10 if we cut through the basin south of Rawford Creek." She looked at him. "We can be there before midnight." He looked back at her for one moment with an expression that was the particular combination of things she had come to understand as his version of the thing other people showed on their faces more openly. "You know this territory better than I do," he said. "Not surprise, just acknowledgement." "You left your maps on the table 6 months ago," she said. "Every night for 3 months. I thought you were reading." "I was reading the maps." He almost smiled. The almost was enough. They rode south through the dark toward Laramie and the Marshal Station in whatever shape tomorrow was going to take. Above them, the Wyoming sky was enormous and full of stars, and behind them, somewhere in Cheyenne, a warrant was being served, or wasn't, and ahead of them, the territory stretched wide and indifferent and beautiful. And through all of it, Nora Kane rode beside her husband and did not look behind her. She was done looking behind her. The ground moved under them, steady and sure, and she thought about Walter Osgood sitting in his brother-in-law's back room with soot in the creases of his face and the ash of 37 years in his eyes. And she thought about Mrs. Hargrove's 4th woman in Denver, with her 3 children, and her Christmas letters, and she thought about all the women she had never met who had run when running was the only option they could see. She thought sometimes you get to stop running. Sometimes you get to make it stop. Sometimes you get to be the kind of person who stops things. The lights of Laramie appeared on the horizon like something promised and then kept. A pen she reached into the saddlebag one-handed as they rode and found the satchel by touch, confirmed its weight. Everything was still there. The confession, the testimony, the warrant, the notary detail that had taken 2 years of frightened memory to finally retrieve. All of it solid, all of it real. She rode toward the lights with the satchel against her side and the revolver in her coat pocket, and the knowledge clear and steady as the stars overhead that some battles were won not with guns or contracts or the intervention of federal judges, but with the simple daily compounding work of refusing to be erased. She intended to keep refusing. Whatever Dr. Silas Vane did next, whatever he still had left to try, she intended to keep refusing. Laramie came up around them, and the Marshal Station was where it was supposed to be lit, and occupied a man in a deputy's badge opening the door before they'd finished tying the horses. "Merritt's wire said you were coming," he said. He looked at them both, at the road dust and the set of their faces, and the satchel Nora was holding the way a person held something they intended not to let go of. "Come inside." They went inside. The day had started with a wedding receipt with the wrong name on it. It was ending with a federal deputy opening a door. In between 36 hours that had stripped away everything except what was actual, what was chosen, what was worth fighting for. Everett looked at her across the threshold of the marshal's station, and she looked back at him, and neither of them said anything because some things were already said in the way two people stood in a doorway at the end of a very long day. She walked through the door first. He followed. Tomorrow was still coming, and Silas Vane was still somewhere in it. But for the first time in 2 years, the tomorrow coming toward her felt like something other than a threat. It felt like the beginning of the part where she got to stay. Marshal Theodore Calvert was a compact, unhurried man who looked like he had been doing his job for long enough that urgency no longer expressed itself in him as noise or movement, only as a particular quality of focused attention. He sat across the desk from them in the Laramie Marshal's station and read what Merritt had sent ahead, a condensed summary of the inquiry, the warrant, the arson affidavit, and then he read it again more slowly. Judge Merritt has a reputation, Calvert said, setting down the papers. For what? Everett asked. For not moving unless he's certain. Calvert looked at the documents. He moved. He moved. Calvert was quiet for a moment. Vane, I know that name. Most people in 3 territories know that name, Nora said. I know it specifically. Calvert opened a desk drawer and pulled out a thin folder. 18 months ago, I had a complaint filed from a freighting company, a small operation out of Casper. Said they'd been systematically undercut on supply contracts that should have gone to competitive bid. Said the bids were being manipulated. Said the man behind it had an arrangement with the Territorial Contracts Office. He tapped the folder. I couldn't prove it. The complaint went quiet. The freighter eventually withdrew because he was afraid. He looked at them. Silas Vane was the name on the initial report. He's been doing this across the entire territory, Nora said. Not just the marriage contract. The agency fraud, the arson, the bribed officials. It's all one pattern. Pattern's one thing, evidence is another. Calvert looked at the satchel. What you're carrying is this everything. Olin's confession, Everett said. Nora's personal testimony, the betrothal receipt, Osgood's arson affidavit, the notary documentation establishing the contract was fraudulently witnessed. He paused. And the freighting complaint if you file it alongside. Calvert looked at this folder in his hand, looked at them. The Denver Marshals are 2 days out. We know. You're asking me to act before they arrive. I'm asking you to accompany us back to Ridgeline and provide federal escort and presence while we wait for the Denver team. Everett's voice was calm. If Vane is in Cheyenne tonight, the warrant may already have him. If it hasn't, he knows the legal walls are closing and his options have narrowed to direct action. Direct action means going to Ridgeline, means going to the ranch. Going home, Nora said, simply. Calvert looked at her. You want to go back to the ranch. I want to stop being somewhere he's chasing me and start being somewhere he has to come to me. She met the marshal's eyes. There's a difference. And with a federal deputy in residence at the property, any move he makes becomes witnessed federal interference, which is a worse crime than anything he's currently charged with. Calvert was quiet for a long moment. He had the quality of stillness that good lawmen develop the ability to think without it showing on the outside. You're using yourself as bait, he said. I'm using myself as evidence, she said. There's a difference. Another long pause. The lamp on the desk threw yellow light across the papers. Outside, Laramie went about its evening, indifferent and ordinary. I'll ride with you in the morning, Calvert said. I'll send a telegraph to Denver tonight, request they route through Ridgeline rather than Cheyenne given developments. He looked at them both. You'll need to sleep first. Both of you. You look like you've been riding and fighting for 36 hours. Closer to 40, Everett said. There's a room in the back. Mrs. Calvert made up the cot for exactly this kind of situation. He stood. We ride at first light. The cot was narrow and the blanket smelled of cedar, and the window looked out on a dark alley that was profoundly uninteresting, which was exactly what Nora needed. She was asleep within minutes of lying down, and this time she didn't wake until Everett's hand on her shoulder pulled her out of dreams she couldn't quite remember, except that they had been for the first time in a long time not frightening. They rode out of Laramie as the sky went pale at the east, Calvert on a big roan, Everett on Mrs. Hargrove's borrowed horse, Nora on the chestnut mare that was becoming, she thought, specifically hers, in the way that animals sometimes became specifically yours without any formal declaration. The road back to Ridgeline ran northwest through country she knew now, country she had ridden, scared and riding scared, had memorized the way you memorize things when you needed them to survive. She rode it differently now. Not calm exactly, there was still too much unresolved for calm, but present. Eyes forward, taking in the ground as it came. Calvert rode without much conversation, which suited her. He was the kind of man who understood that sometimes the most useful thing a person in authority could do was simply be present and let the situation develop. Halfway back, they stopped at a creek to water the horses, and Calvert produced jerky and hardtack from his saddlebag and distributed it without ceremony, and they ate standing up in the early light with the horses drinking around them. "I want to ask you something," Calvert said to Nora. "Ask." "The notary angle, the Pruitt documentation. How certain are you that what you remember is accurate? Courts are going to need precision." "I was 22 when I read that letter," she said. "I am now 24. In that 2 years, I have gone over that letter in my memory approximately 900 times. She looked at him. The address was 412 Mercantile Street, Kansas City. The letterhead was Pruitt, Holloway and Associates. The principal's name was Hervey Wentworth Pruitt. The letter was dated 6 days after the betrothal contract was signed, and it referenced the contract, specifically used the phrase, "The arrangement recently concluded," in the context of confirming the secondary debt transfer. She paused. "I am as certain as a person can be about anything remembered. I acknowledge the limitation. I also know what I read." Calvert studied her. "You'd make a good witness." "I intend to be one." He nodded once, nothing more. They mounted up and continued. Ridgeline came into view mid-afternoon. The familiar cluster of buildings, the water tower, the general store that Mr. Hatfield ran with the particular combination of inefficiency and absolute reliability that characterized every small-town general store Nora had ever encountered. She had been here 6 months, and it felt, she realized, like the word for a place she'd always been heading toward without knowing where it was. They came through town and nobody said anything dramatic. A few people looked. Mr. Hatfield came out of the store and watched them pass and gave Nora the slow, deliberate nod of a man acknowledging something without making a production of it. The ranch road opened before them, running through the gateposts and up toward the house, past the barn where 3 nights of this story had begun and 2 others had continued. The house was exactly as they'd left it. Nora's sewing basket was still where she'd set it down in the kitchen the morning everything started. The salt cellar was still on the table. The lamp on the windowsill was cold and dark. She lit it. Everett brought in the saddlebags. Calvert walked the perimeter of the property with the careful, unhurried attention of a man assessing a position, noting sightlines, checking fences, thinking about approaches. "It's defensible," he said when he came back. "Open enough that you'd see someone coming from a quarter mile in any direction. 1 main road in, 2 exits through the back pasture if needed." "I've been here 11 years, Everett said. "I know the ground." Calvert nodded. "You would." He looked at the house, the barn, the open sweep of prairie beyond. "We wait. Denver marshals in 2 days. Warrant being served in Cheyenne, either already served or he's run." "He won't run," Nora said. Both men looked at her. "I've been thinking about it since we left Cheyenne," she said. "Every time Silas has had a choice between cutting his losses and pressing forward, he's pressed forward. The merchant in Red Hollow, the woman I saw in his household, my father's debt." She was at the kitchen window looking out at the empty yard. "Running means admitting he lost. That isn't something he knows how to do." "Which means he's coming here," Calvert said. "He's coming here. Tonight, tomorrow night," she said. "He'll spend today figuring out what happened, processing the warrant, the arson charge, the Pruitt subpoena. Understanding that the legal route is finished." She turned from the window. "And then he'll come here, because this is where I am and I'm the thing he needs to prove he controls. I'm the proof that everything else can still be salvaged if he can just get this one thing back." Calvert and Everett looked at each other. "She's right," Everett said. Not reluctantly, just factually. "Then we prepare," Calvert said. 2 days until Denver. 1 day if we're lucky until Vane. He looked at Nora. "You should know I'm not going to use you as a target. If he comes, we meet him with the warrant and the federal authority and every legal tool we have. Only if he forces something else does it become something else." "I know," she said. "I want to hear you say you understand that." She met his eyes. "I understand that the law is the first option and the better option and the option that ends this cleanest." She paused. "I also understand that Silas Vane has been operating in the space between legal actions for 15 years and that the law doesn't always arrive in time." "No," Calvert said. "It doesn't always." The afternoon moved into evening. Nora made coffee. Everett and Calvert worked on the perimeter together, establishing sightlines and positioning, talking in the quiet, practical language of men who had both spent time thinking about exactly this kind of problem. She listened from the kitchen window and learned from it. At dusk, Calvert sent his own telegram through the Ridgeline General Store's wire. Mr. Hatfield, having apparently been providing this service for the county without anyone making a formal arrangement about it, to the Denver Marshal's office updating the routing request. The answer came back an hour later. Marshal Rideout and deputy were now routing directly for Ridgeline, ETA approximately 36 hours. 1.5 days. Nora set the telegraph response on the kitchen table beside Olin's confession and Walter Osgood's affidavit and her own 10 pages of testimony and the betrothal receipt with the wrong name on it, and she looked at all of it in the lamplight. Everything they'd built in 5 days, from a crumpled receipt on the kitchen floor to a federal inquiry with 2 approaching marshals and a deputy in residence and an arrest warrant active in Cheyenne. From a woman with a bruised jaw telling a lie about porch steps to a witness prepared to testify before every court that asked. She thought about what Everett had said on the first night, about wild country and its own rules, about men like Silas Vane forgetting that power and money weren't the same as untouchable. She thought about what she was going to do tomorrow, because tomorrow Silas Vane would be coming, or he wouldn't. And if he came, there would be a moment she was certain of it. She could feel its shape in the pattern of everything that had led to it, where the whole thing pivoted on something specific, some choice, some action, some moment that determined whether the legal case they'd built was enough or whether something else was required. She wasn't afraid of that moment. She had been afraid for 2 years. She had run for 2 years. She had managed and concealed and accommodated for 2 years before that. And before that, she had watched a woman in a kitchen doorway get beaten for dropping a dish and understood in one frozen moment what the world was asking her to accept. She had stopped accepting it. Outside, the Wyoming night was large and quiet and entirely itself, and the lamp in the kitchen window threw a small, warm square of light into the dark, and Nora Kane stood in that light and did not flinch from what was coming. Whatever shape tomorrow took, she would be ready for it. She had been getting ready for 2 years. Calvert took the first watch. Everett took over at midnight. Nora slept the deep, structureless sleep of someone whose body had finally processed the last 48 hours and was filing a formal complaint about it. She woke once near 3 in the morning to the sound of an owl somewhere outside, in the distant low of cattle in the north pasture, and she lay still for a moment listening to the ranch breathe around her. It sounded like home. She'd lived in 7 houses in her 24 years. She'd never before had one that sounded like home when she woke up in the dark. She closed her eyes, and the next time she opened them, the window was gray with early light, and Everett was in the kitchen making coffee, and somewhere on the property, Calvert was walking the fence line, and 36 hours from now, the Denver Marshals would be here. And Silas Vane was somewhere between his last calculation and his next move. Let him come, she thought. Let him come and find what was waiting. He came at dusk the following day, not the way she'd expected, not a solitary confrontation, not the small, calculated drama of a man arriving to deliver ultimatums. He came the way he'd operated for 15 years, with preparation, with numbers, with the slow and deliberate application of overwhelming force that had always worked before and that he had no reason yet to believe would fail him now. 7 riders. Calvert spotted them from the north fence line at a distance of nearly a mile, which gave them 20 minutes enough to position enough to communicate enough for Nora to place herself where she'd decided she was going to place herself, rather than where the men in the situation would prefer she was. You should be in the house, Calvert said. I know. She was standing in the yard in the last of the daylight, very visible. That's why I'm out here. Calvert looked at her, looked at Everett. She's not wrong about the strategy, Everett said. I'm aware that she's not wrong about the strategy, Calvert said. I reserve the right to dislike it. Noted, Nora said. What she knew had worked out in the sleepless hours before the sun came up was this: Silas Vane would arrive expecting her to be hidden, protected, kept behind the men who were managing the situation for her. That was how every prior encounter in her life had been configured, and it was the configuration Silas had always operated against the model he understood. The protected woman, the men trying to protect her, the space between where his leverage lived. Take away that configuration, and you changed what he was walking into. She stood in the yard in the last of the daylight, visible from a mile out, and she waited. The riders came through the gate at a walk. Not fast, deliberate, the pace of men who were confident and wanted that confidence to be visible. Silas was in the center of the group, which was where he always positioned himself, grounded, protected the person who occupied the point from which all other distances were measured. He had dressed for this. She noticed it with a strange clarity, A good coat boots that had been brushed, the particular presentation of a man who believed that how you looked when you arrived communicated what the outcome was going to be. He had arrived to collect. Everything about how he dressed said so. He pulled up 20 yards from where she stood. They looked at each other across that distance, and in the fading light, his face was the same face it had always been, controlled, certain faintly amused by the inconvenience of having been made to travel this far for something that should have been simple. His men spread out on either side. She counted quickly. 7, as Calvert had reported, all armed. She looked at him and felt nothing she recognized as fear. She felt something else, something harder and less forgiving than fear. "Nora," he said, pleasantly, as though they were meeting for the first time in a long time and the circumstances were ordinary. "You look better." "I had a few days to recover," she said. He smiled. It didn't change his eyes. "I want to talk about ending this cleanly," he said. "I think we've both—" "There is a federal arrest warrant active in Cheyenne for your arrest on charges of arson on federal land," she said. She kept her voice level, the way she'd keep her voice level reading something aloud to students who needed to understand it clearly. "There is an active federal inquiry into mail fraud involving the corruption of a postal employee who provided your agents with private Continental Marriage Agency records. There is a motion to void your betrothal contract on the grounds that the notarizing party was your own attorney rather than an independent witness, which constitutes fraudulent execution." She paused. "Deputy Marshal Theodore Calvert of the Federal Marshal's Office is present on this property. Federal marshals from Denver are approximately 12 hours away." Silas looked at her for a moment. Then he looked to his right, where nothing was visible. Then he looked to his left, where nothing was visible. "I don't see a deputy marshal," he said. "He sees you," Calvert said. His voice came from the barn roof, which Everett had helped him access from the inside 40 minutes ago. He was above them and behind them with a clear sight line over the entire yard in both approaches. Silas looked up. He located Calvert on the barn roof. He looked at the rifle Calvert was holding. The smile stayed on his face, but it changed quality, shifting from the easy confidence of a man arriving to conclude something to the more careful expression of a man doing a rapid reassessment. "And you," Nora said, "are going to hear what I have to say, and then you're going to make a decision." "Am I?" he said. "Yes." She looked at him directly. "Because you are a man who has spent 15 years making decisions based on what he can control, and everything you thought you controlled has been removed in the last 5 days. And you have 2 choices left. The one that ends this in a courtroom where everything comes out through proper channels, or the one where you try to take what you came for and find out what happens." "What happens?" he said flatly. "You have 7 men," she said. 5 of them are looking at the barn roof and at 2 positions along the fence line where Everett has been standing very still for the last 15 minutes. Your men have been trained to manage the people in front of them. They haven't been trained to calculate how many angles they're exposed from." She paused. "Silas, think." The moment stretched. She watched him think. Not metaphorically, she could actually see it happening, see the calculation running behind his eyes, the rapid inventory of what was present and what was absent, and what the actual math looked like once the certainty of arrival had been stripped away. He had come here knowing the legal position was compromised. He had come anyway because the alternative retreat acknowledgement of failure. The visible loss of something he had publicly claimed was not something he could accommodate internally. She had understood this about him for 2 years without having words for it. Now she had words. He was not afraid of prison. He was afraid of the story. He was afraid of the version of himself that existed in other people's knowledge of him, and the story was shifting, and he could feel it shifting, and everything he was doing was in service of stopping that shift before it became permanent. "You could testify," she said. Her voice was different now. Not the clear reading aloud quality, something more direct, more personal. About the betrothal contract, about what my father was told and what he agreed to under what circumstances. About who Hervé Wentworth Pruitt is and what role he played. She held his gaze. "You cooperate with the federal inquiry. You tell the truth about how the contract was executed and the investigation into your other activities. The freighting contracts, the bribery. The rest of it moves significantly more slowly." He looked at her. "That's not an offer I can make," she said. "I have no authority to negotiate anything, but it's how these situations work, and you know it. You've used it before. You've been the one with leverage, the one who had information and used it to moderate what the law could do to you. You're asking me to give testimony against myself, he said. I'm telling you what the options look like from where I'm standing. She met his eyes. Because you beat me in my own kitchen and called me stolen and property and burned an old man's house to the ground. And you have been the thing in my life that made everything else impossible, and I am standing in this yard telling you that it's over. Not because I'm not afraid of you, but because I was afraid of you for 2 years and it didn't make anything better. So I stopped. The word stopped landed in the quiet like a stone. Silas Vane looked at her. Behind her, she heard Everett's quiet footfall as he moved from the fence line to the yard, coming to stand beside her. Not in front of her. Beside. Calvert hadn't moved from the barn roof. One of Vane's men shifted in the saddle. The movement was audible in the silence. Leather against leather, the small sound of someone recalibrating their position. Then another man did the same. Small adjustments, a barely visible reconfiguration, the body language of men who were no longer certain they were on the winning side of what they'd ridden into. Silas watched his men recalibrate. Something in his face changed. It was subtle. The adjustment was not dramatic, not a collapse, not anything that could be described as surrender in any conventional sense. It was the microscopic shift of a man reaching the end of a calculation and finding the result different from what he'd expected, and understanding that there was a version of forward and a version of backward, and they didn't both look the same from this position. "You'll want this," Calvert said from the barn roof. He dropped something. A folded document tied with a cord fell through the air and landed in the dust of the yard. Nora didn't pick it up, neither did Everett. Silas looked at it. "Arrest warrant," Calvert said. "Federal, arson on surveyed land, witnessed and signed by Judge Benjamin, Merritt Cheyenne Circuit Court. You are currently under obligation to surrender to federal authority." His voice was even official, entirely without theater. "Mr. Vane, surrender your weapons and step down from your horse." The 7 men looked at each other. This was the moment. Nora had known it was coming in the abstract. She hadn't known exactly what shape it would take, but she had known there was a moment toward which everything was moving. The kind of moment where the thing that had been building for years either resolved or broke in the wrong direction. Silas looked at the warrant in the dust. He looked at Nora. She looked back at him. "You think you won," he said. His voice was flat, not angry, emptied of something. "You think this is the part where you win." "I think this is the part where it stops," she said. "Whether you win or lose is something a court decides." A long moment in which nobody moved. Then Silas Vane reached with deliberate slowness across his body and drew his revolver from the holster. Every muscle in the yard tensed. He held the weapon at his side. Not raised, not aimed, simply held as though the physical possession of it was the last thing he had that was still unambiguously his. "If I put this down," he said slowly, "it's finished. Everything I built." "What you built," Nora said, "was built on other people's fear. It was finished the moment I stopped being afraid." Another moment. The last of the daylight was bleeding out of the sky at the western edge, going from orange to the deep amber that preceded dark. The yard was very still. Somewhere behind the barn, a nightjar called once and then was silent. Silas Vane set his revolver on the ground. The sound it made was very small. His men, reading the moment with the professional instinct of people who understood which direction the tide was running, began one by one to follow. Gun belts unbuckled, weapons lowered, the small successive sounds of capitulation moving through 7 men like a wave that had already spent itself. Calvert came down from the barn roof. He moved to Vane with the businesslike efficiency of a man performing a function he had performed many times, and he spoke the formal words of federal arrest in a voice that was neither triumphant nor unkind, and he put the handcuffs on Silas Vane's wrists with the quiet finality of a thing that had been a long time coming. Nora stood and watched. She had expected to feel something large, something proportional to how long this had taken and how much it had cost. What she felt was much simpler and much harder to name. Not satisfaction. Satisfaction implied that something had been resolved to her specifications, and this was messier than that, more contingent, more human. Not relief. Relief implied the danger was entirely past, and she knew it wasn't. Not yet, not until the courts finished what they'd started. What she felt standing in the yard in the last of the Wyoming light was something closer to the feeling of putting down a weight you'd been carrying so long, you'd forgotten it was weight and not just the ordinary shape of your shoulders. Everett came to stand beside her. He didn't say anything. She didn't say anything. After a moment, she reached out and found his hand in the near dark, and he closed his fingers around hers, and they stood together and watched Calvert manage the logistics of 7 disarmed men and 1 arrested prisoner in the quiet efficiency of someone who was very good at what he did. 12 hours, she said. Until Denver, he said. Yes. We hold him here until they arrive. Calvert can manage that. She looked at the figure of Silas Vane standing with his hands bound in the middle of the ranch yard, looking at nothing in particular. He was not the man he had been when he'd ridden through that gate. The coat that had been pressed and deliberate was dusty now. The expression that had communicated absolute certainty was gone, replaced by something she didn't have a word for, not humility, because that required something that wasn't in him, but its functional equivalent, the state produced by the removal of every prop that had made certainty possible. She felt something unexpected looking at him. Not compassion, she was too honest to call it that, but something in the same general country. The recognition that very few people set out to become what he had become. That fear and money and the particular education that came from 15 years of never hearing no had shaped him into something that had done enormous damage, and that the damage was real and the accounting was necessary, and nothing about that changed the fact that he was still a human being standing in a ranch yard at the end of something. She turned away from him. She walked toward the house. Behind her, she heard Calvert's voice giving instructions, heard the quiet sounds of horses being led to the barn, heard the ordinary operational noise of a situation being managed by competent people. She went into the kitchen and she lit the lamp on the windowsill and she put water on for coffee. The kitchen looked the same as it always had. The sewing basket was beside the door. The salt cellar was on the table. The crack in the left side window pane that she'd been meaning to mention to Everett was still there, catching the lamplight and bending it into a faint prismatic edge. She set her hands flat on the table. 5 days. Everything had changed in 5 days. And also nothing had changed. The kitchen was the same kitchen, the table was the same table, the crack was still in the window and still needed mentioning. Life had a way of doing that, of presenting its ordinariness with total indifference to whatever extraordinary thing had just happened adjacent to it. She thought she was beginning to understand that the ordinariness was the point, not the extraordinary thing, the return to the ordinary, the ability to come back to the table with the crack in the window and put water on and wait for your husband to come through the door. That was what she'd been fighting for. Not freedom in the abstract, not the defeat of a specific man. Those were means to an end, and the end was this: the kitchen, the lamp, the water coming to a slow boil, the sound of boots on the porch steps. Everett came through the door. He looked at her, she looked at him. Calvert has it in hand, he said. I know. He crossed the kitchen and sat in his usual chair. The one on the right, the one he'd been sitting in since before she'd arrived, the one she'd thought of as his, ever since the first time she'd sat across from him and tried to figure out what kind of man he was. She poured 2 cups of coffee and set one in front of him. I need to tell you something, she said. He waited. I'm going to testify, she said. Everything. Every court that asks. However many times, however long it takes. She sat down across from him. I'm going to tell every detail of everything that happened, and I'm going to do it clearly and in public, and I am not going to soften it or manage it or make it easier for anyone to hear. She met his eyes. I know that's difficult. I know what that means for the next year, maybe longer. I know what it means, he said. You're all right with it. It's not my choice to make. His voice was even. But yes, I'm all right with it. She looked at him for a moment. I want to help other women, she said. The ones like me, the ones who are still running. She had been thinking about this for a while, not just the last 5 days, but for months, since the fear had started to ease enough that she could think about something other than her own immediate situation. There are more of them. There are always more of them. And most of them don't find the right name in the right registry at the right time. Most of them don't get to stop. Then we help them stop, he said. She looked at him. You said we, she said. I said we. He picked up his coffee. You'd need a proper office, correspondence space, some kind of connection to the agency network, so you know who to reach when a woman needs placing somewhere safe. He considered. Merritt would help. He'd know how to structure it legally. Nora looked at her husband in the lamplight of the kitchen, with the water boiling on the stove and the sound of the Wyoming wind against the windows, and she thought about how strange and specific the road had been that brought her here to this table, to this conversation. Who were you, she had asked him the first night. Someone who survived worse than Silas Vane, he had said. She understood now what that meant. Not just the range scout's history, not just the scouting years and the border conflicts and the things a man carries when he's spent a decade in dangerous country and come out of it alive. She meant the other kind of survival, the kind that came from losing something you hadn't thought you could survive, losing and discovering that you were still there on the far side, still recognizably yourself, still capable of choosing something, still capable of choosing. Outside, Calvert's voice moved through the yard in the patient, efficient cadences of a man completing a job. Inside, the lamp burned steady against the dark. Tomorrow, the Denver marshals would arrive. The formal process would begin. Court's testimony, documentation, all the slow and grinding machinery of justice doing what it did when it worked. Tonight, there was just this two people at a kitchen table in a house they'd built together, surrounded by the ordinary, persistent fact of a life that had refused to be unmade. She reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. He turned his hand over. They sat there in this kitchen in the last of the evening, and the coffee went slowly cold, and neither of them moved. The 12 hours until the Denver marshals arrived were the strangest hours Nora had lived through in a long time. Not because anything dramatic happened in them, but because nothing did. Calvert managed Silas Vane and his men with the quiet competence she had already come to expect from him. The hired riders were disarmed and released on their recognizance to ride back to wherever they'd come from, with the understanding that every name Calvert had written down would be forwarded to the federal inquiry, and that cooperation with that inquiry was in each man's personal interest. Most of them, she thought, had not signed up for federal charges when they'd taken Vane's money. Most of them would find cooperation considerably more attractive than the alternative. Two of them, the ones who had been at the burned ranch, whose faces Walter Osgood had described in his affidavit, were held alongside Vane. Calvert set up in this bunkhouse. He was undemanding and organized, and by midnight had established a routine that made the whole situation feel more like a constrained formality than the conclusion of something that had nearly killed them. Nora slept. She woke at 4 in the morning and lay still in the dark, listening, and realized after a moment that she had woken from an ordinary dream. Something about a garden, something about yellow light through curtains, and not from the particular quality of wakefulness that came from fear. The fear waking had a texture she knew, precisely a certain quality of the first moment of consciousness where the adrenaline was already running before the mind had assembled the reason. This wasn't that. This was just waking up. She lay still for another moment and paid attention to what that felt like. Then she got up and went to the kitchen and made coffee and sat at the table with the lamp low and read through her own testimony one more time, not anxiously, not checking for errors, but the way you read something you'd written when you wanted to remember that you had written it, that it existed, that the story had been told and was now real in the way that written things were real, available to be read by others, impossible to unsay. Everett found her there when he came in from his own early watch. He poured himself the last of the coffee and sat down, and she slid her testimony across the table to him. He read it in silence, all 10 pages. She watched him read. When he finished, he set it down and looked at her. "This is a good thing you've done," he said. "It's accurate," she said. "That's all?" "That's everything." She thought about that. The Denver marshals arrived just after noon on a bright, clean day that smelled of sage and the particular quality of Wyoming air after a night of high wind. Two men marshal Rideout, a heavy-set veteran with 20 years on his badge and the air of someone who had seen every kind of complicated situation and had developed useful opinions about all of them. And Deputy Kellner, who was young enough that his mustache was still speculative, but who moved with a careful, attentive efficiency that spoke well of whoever had trained him. Rideout read the file Calvert had prepared. Read Merritt's documents, read the affidavits, read Nora's testimony. He looked up. "You built this in 5 days. 4.5, she said. He looked at Everett, at the satchel on the table, everything in order, everything documented. At Calvert, who was sitting at the far end of the table with the expression of a man who has done his job correctly and has no particular need to be congratulated about it. Rideout looked back at Nora. "You the one who figured out the notary angle?" he asked. "Yes. That's going to void the contract in about 20 minutes of court time," he said. "The fraud inquiry will take longer. The arson trial will be in federal court, and I expect it will be straightforward." He tapped the file. "The betrothal question, though, you'll have the ruling within a month. Maybe less." "I can wait a month," she said. He looked at her for a moment in the way that people who had spent a long time dealing with difficult situations looked at someone who had handled one correctly. "Where is he?" he asked. Calvert stood. "Bunkhouse. 2 men with him." They transferred Silas Vane to federal custody in the ranch yard on a bright Wyoming afternoon, with the sky enormous and blue overhead and the cattle visible in the north pasture, going about their indifferent business, and the whole wide country just continuing as it always did, as though the specific dramas of human beings were interesting but ultimately local. Silas looked at Nora as they walked him to the marshal's horses. He didn't say anything. She didn't say anything. There was nothing left to say that hadn't already been said in every way that mattered. She watched until he was out of sight down the ranch road. Then she turned and walked back to the house. Behind her, she heard Everett and Calvert talking with Rideout Logistics documentation court schedules, the administrative infrastructure of the thing they'd built. She heard the easy, practical tone of men who had work to do and were discussing how to do it. She went into the kitchen. She picked up the arnica tin from the windowsill where she'd left it after she'd finally used it, and she put it back in the medicine cabinet. She washed the coffee cups. She opened the window over the sink and let the afternoon air come in, carrying the smell of grass and cattle and the particular clean quality of the open country that she had learned in 6 months to breathe all the way down. The crack in the left side pane caught the afternoon light and bent it sideways. She'd mentioned it to Everett tonight. It wasn't urgent. It could wait until they'd had supper and the marshals had gone and the yard was quiet again. Some things could wait. The good things could wait because the good things weren't going anywhere. She put her hands in the soapy water and looked out the window at the windy Wyoming afternoon and understood for what felt like the first time in a very long time that she was somewhere she intended to be. Not somewhere she had arrived at by running, somewhere she had chosen. The afternoon moved toward evening. The ranch settled into its ordinary sounds. From the yard, she could hear Everett's voice and occasionally Calvert's, and once Rideout's laugh, a big, unguarded sound that surprised her into smiling at the window. In a while, she would make supper. In a month, maybe less, Rideout had said a judge would sign a document that said the contract was void. In some longer time, she would stand in a courtroom and tell a story she had been carrying for 2 years, and it would be entered into a record where it would exist permanently available, unable to be unmade. And in all the time between and after that, she would be here, in this kitchen, in this house, on this land that smelled of sage and cattle, and the wide, indifferent, magnificent Wyoming sky. She rinsed the last cup and set it on the shelf. She dried her hands. She went to the door and stood in it and looked out at the yard where her husband was talking with the marshals in the last of the afternoon light, and she thought, this is the part I was fighting for. Not the victory, not the warrant, not the moment in the yard when Silas Vane put his revolver on the ground. This, the ordinary late afternoon. The man she'd chosen, the door she could stand in without looking over her shoulder. She crossed her arms in the doorway and watched the light move across the yard and didn't go anywhere at all. Rideout stayed for supper. This was apparently standard practice, he explained, when Nora set a fourth place at the table without asking that he had learned early in his career that the best debriefs happened over food because food gave people something to do with their hands and their eyes when the conversation moved through territory that was hard to navigate directly. He ate the way men who traveled constantly ate, with full attention and without waste, appreciating what was in front of him rather than comparing it to something else. Calvert, who had been on the property for 24 hours and had already developed a relationship with the kitchen coffee pot that bordered on personal, sat at the end of the table and ate with the same quiet efficiency he brought to everything. Everett carved the bread. Nora set the pot on a trivet in the center. The conversation at the table was not as she'd expected, primarily about Vane or the inquiry or the coming trial. It moved through those things but didn't stay in them. Rideout asked about the ranch, how long, what acreage, what the cattle market had been doing in the territory over the past season. He had an opinion about the winter grazing situation in the eastern half of the territory that turned out to be informed and interesting. Calvert, who had grown up on a farm in Ohio before he'd gone west, contributed a parallel observation about soil erosion along creek beds that took the conversation somewhere entirely different. Nora listened and ate and refilled cups when they needed refilling. It struck her somewhere in the middle of this that this was the first time she had sat at this table with people she wasn't afraid of and nothing she needed to manage or conceal. 6 months she'd been in this house, and every night at this table, some part of her had been somewhere else, running through scenarios, checking plans, measuring the distance between where she was and where Silas might be. Even in the good evenings, the calm ones there had been a portion of her attention that she couldn't fully bring back. Tonight, that portion was here. It was such a small thing to notice, such an ordinary small thing. She noticed it anyway. After supper, Rideout spread his own documents on the table. The formal transfer papers, the charges as they were currently constituted, the preliminary schedule for the federal inquiry. He walked Everett through the procedural expectations, depositions, appearances, the timeline that the fraud case would likely follow. He was direct without being clinical. He treated Everett as someone capable of understanding what was being explained to him, which Nora had noticed was not universal among official people. Then he looked at her. "Your testimony," he said. "I've read what you provided to Merritt. It's the clearest personal account I've seen in a case like this. No equivocating, no hedging, no apology for existing." He paused. "I want you to know that what you wrote is exactly what we need. The court will ask you to speak it aloud. Will you be able to do that?" "Yes," she said. "It's harder than writing it," he said. "You write it alone. You speak it in front of people, including people whose job is to challenge it." "I know what cross-examination is," she said. "I was a school teacher." Something moved in Rideout's expression. Amusement, she thought, or its close neighbor. "Fair enough," he said. He gathered his papers and stood. "I'll take the prisoner to Cheyenne tomorrow morning. The inquiry formally opens in 2 weeks. You'll receive a summons by mail, but I'm telling you now so you can plan." He looked at them both. "You did good work here. Difficult work and good work. Not everyone in your position would have moved the way you did." Everett said nothing. Nora said, "We didn't have another option." "Most people find options," Rideout said. "Most people find reasons to look the other way. Wait it out, let someone else handle it." He picked up his hat. "You didn't." He set the hat on his head and nodded once, the particular nod of a man who said what he meant and had now said it. "Good night." Calvert followed him out. The kitchen settled into the particular quiet of a house. After company had left, richer somehow than ordinary quiet, the room still carrying some warmth from the presence of people. Nora cleared the plates. Everett banked the fire. She was drying the last dish when he came to stand beside her at the basin. "You should sleep," he said. "I know. You're not going to." "I'm going to." She set down the dish. "I'm just going to sit for a while first." He looked at her. She looked at him. In the lamplight, he looked the same as he had looked that first morning when she'd stepped off the stagecoach in Ridgeline, and he'd been waiting with a cart in the straightforward manner of a man who had said he would be there and was there. She had thought in that first moment solid, had thought this is what solid looks like. She still thought that. "I keep thinking about what Mrs. Hargrove said," she said. "About the 4 women, the 3 who kept running. And the 4th," and he said. "And the 4th," she folded the dish towel. "I keep thinking about the 3, about where they are right now, tonight." She looked out the dark window. Still looking over their shoulders, still waiting for the knock. "We can't help everyone," he said. "Not all at once." "No." She set the towel on the counter. "But we can help some of them, and some is more than none." She turned to face him. "You meant it. What you said about the office, the correspondence, the agency connections." "I meant it. It'll be a lot of work. So is the ranch." She looked at him for a moment with the peculiar feeling she'd had several times in the last 5 days. The feeling of discovering that the man she'd married was larger than the edges she could see, that every time she found what she thought was the boundary of him, there was more beyond it. "I chose well," she said. "So did I," he said. She took the lamp and walked through the house to the bedroom, and she set the lamp on the dresser and looked at herself in the small mirror above it. The bruises had faded to the edge of invisible, a slight discoloration along the jaw. If you were looking for it, nothing more. In another week, they would be entirely gone. She looked at her own face for a long moment. She looked like someone who had come through something. She looked like someone on the other side of it. She blew out the lamp and lay down in the dark, and outside the Wyoming wind moved through the grass the way it always did, steady and unimpressed by anything. And somewhere on the ranch, Calvert was keeping watch for a threat that was no longer coming out of professional habit and nothing else, and it was the most ordinary night she had spent in this house since the day she'd arrived. She was asleep within minutes. 3 weeks later, a letter arrived from Cheyenne. It came through the Ridgeline General Store on a Tuesday morning, addressed in the precise institutional hand of a court clerk bearing the seal of the Federal Circuit Court and the stamp of Judge Benjamin Merritt's office. Mr. Hatfield held it out to her with the careful gravity of a man who understood that some mail weighed more than its paper, and she thanked him and tucked it inside her coat and walked home. She didn't open it on the road. She waited until she was in the kitchen, until she had hung her coat and put water on, and sat down at the table where it had all begun, the table with the salt cellar and the lamp on the windowsill, and the crack in the left side pane that Everett had finally glazed 2 weeks ago, and that she had decided she was going to miss slightly now that it was gone. Then she opened it. The letter was 4 paragraphs, formal, precise, the language of judicial determination rendered in the particular register that said, "This is a thing that has been decided, and the deciding is now real." The betrothal contract between Nora Ellswood and Silas Vane, executed on the 14th day of March, 1879, was hereby declared null and void on the grounds of improper notarization by a party with material interest in the contract's execution, constituting fraudulent witnessing under federal statute. The contract had no legal standing, had never had legal standing, and could not be enforced, referenced, or revived in any judicial proceeding. Her marriage to Everett James Kane, contracted freely and without coercion on the 22nd day of October 1879, was confirmed as valid, binding, and unconditional. She read the last paragraph twice. She set the letter on the table. She looked at it for a long moment, the way you looked at something you had been waiting for long enough that the actual arrival of it required a moment to become real. Then she picked it up, folded it along its original creases, and walked out to the barn, where Everett was working on a harness that had needed attention for the better part of a month. She didn't say anything. She just held the letter out. He took it with hands that were slightly dirty from the leatherwork. He read it standing up the way he read everything. When he finished, he folded it again and handed it back. "There it is," he said. "There it is," she said. He went back to the harness. She stood in the barn doorway in the October sun for a moment longer, the letter in her hand, and felt the last of something she hadn't quite been able to name release itself from somewhere in her chest. Not the fear which had been releasing gradually over the 3 weeks since Vane had been taken away, but the uncertainty. The one part of her that had been waiting to be told officially, in the language that courts used, that this was real and belonged to her and could not be taken. She had that now. The trial had been set for February. Rideout had written twice with updates. The fraud case was building towards something comprehensive, he'd said, using a language that managed to be both official and satisfied. Porter's testimony, when it finally came, had been exactly what Merritt had predicted, a man who had been waiting for someone to offer him a reason to tell the truth and who, once he started, found it difficult to stop. Names, dates, specific transactions, the particular shape of Silas Vane's operation across 3 years and 4 territories. The notary Pruitt had been located in Kansas City, where he had initially denied everything with the confident energy of a man who believed his relationship with Vane would protect him. Rideout's wire about that had been brief and dry. Pruitt cooperative as of Tuesday. Records subpoenaed, client list extensive. The list it had emerged was very extensive indeed. Silas Vane, Rideout had written in his most recent communication, was unlikely to see the outside of a federal institution for the better part of 30 years. Walter Osgood had received an emergency federal settlement for the burned property. It wasn't enough to replace 37 years in a single payment, but it was enough to rebuild, which was not nothing. He had come to Ridgeline 2 weeks ago to thank them in person, he and his wife and his daughter arriving in a borrowed wagon staying for lunch. His wife had brought a pie. Nora had thought, eating it at the kitchen table with the Osgood family and Everett across from her, that there were moments that didn't have a good name in any language she'd ever learned, moments that were just the specific experience of understanding that something had turned out. This was one of them. She went back into the house and put the letter in the small cedar box she'd started keeping on the bedroom dresser. The box that held the thing she was keeping, the paper record of how this story had gone. Olin's confession was in there, the original. Her own testimony in her own hand. The first letter Everett had written back to the agency, which she'd found folded in his desk and asked to keep. The arnica tins paper label, which had come loose when she'd finally used the last of it, and which she had kept for reasons she didn't examine too closely. The court ruling went in beside them. She closed the box. She went to the window and looked out at the ranch, the wide yard, the barn, the north pasture where the cattle were moving with the slow, purposeful drift of animals who had things to do and were doing them. The October light was the best light of the year in Wyoming. She had decided, low and golden and long-shadowed, the kind that made ordinary things look exactly like what they were, which was already considerable. In the corner of the bedroom, in a wooden crate she'd moved in from the barn last week, were the first letters. 12 of them arrived in 3 weeks from women across the territory. She didn't know how word had spread. She suspected Mrs. Hargrove, who had the communication instincts of someone who had been running a discreet, informal network for years without calling it that, but it had spread. A rancher's wife in Carbon County who had received a letter from a man she'd been trying to escape. A widow in Sweetwater whose brother-in-law was threatening her property. Three women in Laramie who had heard through the particular underground of shared knowledge that women in difficult situations maintained that there was someone in Ridgeline who had faced something like what they were facing and had found a way through. She had answered every letter. She had answered them carefully, specifically, with the particular quality of attention that she had given to her own situation when it mattered most, not with sympathy alone, which was abundant and insufficient, but with information. What agencies existed? What legal remedies were available? Who in Cheyenne and Laramie and Denver was worth contacting and who was not? When to involve a marshal and when to build a paper record first. Merritt had written with names of reliable contacts. Calvert had sent a short, practical letter outlining federal options that most women in territorial circumstances didn't know they had. Rideout had included, without comment, a half-page summary of relevant federal statutes in his last communication as though it were a routine enclosure. She was building something. She didn't yet know exactly what shape it was going to take, but she could feel its outline, the way you could feel the outline of something in the dark, solid present, larger than any single component of it. Everett had cleared the small room off the kitchen that had been used for storage. He'd brought in a proper desk from town, a real one, substantial with drawers that worked, and a good lamp and a chair that didn't wobble. He'd done it on a Tuesday afternoon while she was answering letters at the kitchen table, and when she'd walked into the room and found the desk there, he had been in the barn with absolutely no expression on his face. She had let him maintain his dignity about it. The desk was where she worked now. Every morning after the first cup of coffee and before the day's other demands, she sat at the desk and worked through whatever correspondence had arrived. Some of it was administrative, the formal channels of the federal inquiry, the court schedules, the documentation requests that came with being a principal witness in an active case. Some of it was the letters. She was working through one of the letters, a woman in Rawlins, a situation with a deceased husband's business partner who was claiming ownership of a property he had no legal basis to claim when she heard hoofbeats in the yard. Not the ordinary sound of Everett coming back from the pasture. Multiple horses, a heavier approach. She was at the window in 3 steps. 2 riders in the yard, both in the light-colored coats of travelers rather than ranch workers. A woman and a younger girl, a daughter she thought from the similarity of their posture. They had ridden hard, the horses showed it. The woman was looking at the house with the particular expression of someone who had come a long way on a direction they weren't entirely certain about. Nora was out the front door before either of them had dismounted. "Mrs. Kane?" the woman called. "Yes," Nora said. The woman's face changed, not dramatically, not a collapse into relief, but a small, visible shift that Nora recognized. The specific release of someone who has been holding something tightly for a long time and has just found the place where they can set it down for a moment. "Mrs. Hargrove in Cheyenne said you might be able to help us," the woman said. "My name is Ada Breckenridge. This is my daughter, Clara." She paused. "We've been riding since yesterday." "Come inside," Nora said. She was already moving toward the horses to help with the hitching. "I'll put water on. Tell me what's happened, and we'll figure out what to do." Ada Breckenridge looked at her for one moment, the kind of look that people gave when they were checking whether what was being offered was real or performance. She must have found her answer because she dismounted. They went inside. This was how it worked. Nora would come to understand over the months and years that followed. Not in dramatic gestures, not in the kind of moments that announce themselves as significant. In ordinary Tuesday afternoons with the water heating on the stove and a stranger sitting across the desk and 12 letters in a wooden crate, in the particular quality of attention that it was possible to give someone when you had stopped spending it on fear. Ada Breckenridge's situation took 3 days to begin resolving and 3 months to fully untangle a deceased husband's debt, a business partner with a legitimate seeming but procedurally defective claim, a county sheriff who needed to be educated about the applicable federal statute before he was willing to act. Calvert helped with the sheriff. Merritt's name opened the door with the county recorder's office. The women stayed at the ranch for 2 nights before heading back to Rawlins with a letter from Nora to a reliable attorney in Casper, a copy of the relevant statute and explicit instructions about what to say and in what order. The daughter Clara was 16 and had her mother's eyes and a quality of focused attention that Nora recognized. Before they left, she pulled Nora aside. "Will it work?" she asked. The directness of someone who had been frightened long enough to run out of patience for circumlocution. "What you've sent us with, will it actually work?" Nora looked at her. "Probably," she said. "Not certainly. The law doesn't always do what it should, and people don't always do what they're supposed to, and there will be moments when it seems like it's not going to work. She paused. But you have more tools now than you had 2 days ago, and every tool you use correctly builds the next one. Clara looked at her with the 16-year-old's uncanny ability to assess whether what an adult was saying was true or comfortable. You sound like you know, she said. I know, Nora said. February came. The trial opened in a Cheyenne courtroom on a cold morning with light snow falling outside the tall windows, and the particular quality of stillness that formal proceedings produced a room full of people, all oriented toward a single process, the machine of it, moving with the deliberate gravity that Merritt had described when he'd warned her that courts move slowly on purpose. She sat in the witness chair and looked out at the room. She saw right out at the prosecution table, organized and unhurried. She saw Calvert in the gallery present because the arson charge required his direct testimony, and because she suspected he was also there for reasons that had nothing to do with official obligation. She saw Walter Osgood and his wife 3 rows back, the old man still carrying the straight-shouldered dignity of someone who has decided that what happened to him was not going to change who he was. She saw Everett. He was sitting in the gallery where witnesses' families sat, which was where he had every right to sit, and he was watching her with the expression she had learned to read as his version of the things other people said, with their faces steady, certain percent. Not there to rescue her, there because she was there. She looked at him for one moment. Then she looked at the court. The prosecution attorney said, "Mrs. Kane, please tell the court in your own words how you first came to know the defendant, Silas Vane." She took a breath. She told the story. She told it clearly, without hedging, without the apologetic qualifications that frightened people put around their own experience to make it more acceptable to the listener. She told it as it had happened in sequence, with the specific details that made it real. The oval notary seal, the initials inside it, the letter in her father's study, the woman in the doorway with the dropped dish the week before the ceremony, when she'd paid her registration fee with coins saved over 3 years. She told it for 90 minutes. The defense attorney questioned her for 40. He was good at his job, skilled at the kind of questioning that looked for inconsistencies in memory, that pressed on emotional moments, hoping to destabilize the witness. She answered everything directly. She acknowledged what she didn't know. She held what she did know without apology. When it was over, she stepped down from the witness chair and walked back to where she was sitting, and she didn't look at Silas Vane, who had been watching her the entire time with an expression she had no interest in reading. She looked at Everett, who was still in the gallery, still watching with the same quality of attention he'd had when she'd started. She sat down. The court continued. The verdict came 6 days later. Guilty on 5 of 6 counts, the arson charge, 3 counts of federal mail fraud, conspiracy, and witness intimidation. The 6th count, a secondary fraud charge related to the railroad contracts that Olin had described, was dismissed on a technical procedural ground that the prosecutor explained to them afterward, with the contained frustration of a man who had learned to accept procedural losses without letting them change the overall accounting. 31 years in federal prison. Nora read the telegram from Rideout, sitting at her desk on a Thursday morning, with the letters in their wooden crate and the lamp burning against the gray autumn light, and the sound of Everett somewhere outside doing something useful and ordinary. 31 years. She set the telegram down, picked up her pen, returned to the letter she had been writing before the telegram arrived, the woman in Carbon County, the property dispute, the brother-in-law with the threatening letter. She had told her what she knew. She had given her the tools. Now the woman would have to use them, and it would be difficult and imperfect and probably have moments when it seemed impossible, and she would get through it, or she wouldn't, and Nora would be here either way at this desk with this lamp, answering the next letter and the one after that. The pen moved across the paper. Outside, Wyoming went about its business. The cattle in the north pasture, the October light coming through the window at its particular angle. The crack that had been in the left side pane now glazed over and invisible unless you knew to look, and even then barely there, a faint line in the glass, a record of where it had been. Some marks stayed, some healed almost entirely. The ones that mattered most, she had come to think, were the ones that taught you something worth keeping. She finished the letter, folded it, addressed the envelope in her careful school teacher's hand. Tomorrow there would be more letters. There would always be more letters. And she would answer them one by one, because that was the work. And the work was the point, not the verdict, not the warrant, not any single moment of resolution, but the daily compounding, irreversible fact of showing up for it. She stood and stretched and went to the kitchen door and looked out at the ranch in the late afternoon. Everett was at the fence line working. He looked up and saw her in the doorway and gave the small nod that was his version of a wave. She gave it back. The sun moved towards the western ridge. The cattle drifted. The grass moved in the wind with its steady, unhurried sound. She had been afraid for 2 years and running for most of them, and now she was here at the door of a house she had chosen, looking at a life she had fought for, with more letters to write in the morning and the certain unhurried knowledge that she intended to write them. She crossed her arms in the doorway. She was not going anywhere. A year after the trial, when people asked about the mail-order bride who had brought down Silas Vane, Nora would say what she told Clara Breckenridge, that it hadn't been one thing, that it had never been one dramatic moment, that the whole story was made of smaller things. A signed confession, a notary seal, a marshal's bluff on a dark road, a woman in a boarding house who knew which alley was safest. And if they pressed her on the part that mattered most, she would tell them the truth. That the part that mattered most was the part she had done first and kept doing every day since. She had stopped running. Everything else followed from that. The door of the house stood open behind her, and the ranch stretched wide in the last of the day's light, and the letters were on the desk, and the pen was in the inkwell, and tomorrow was going to be a great deal of work. She thought it might be the best thing she had ever looked forward to. She turned and went back inside, and the door closed behind her on a world that was for the first time in a very long time exactly the world she intended to live in. But the work of those months, the letters, the women, the slow building of something that didn't yet have a formal name, was not the only thing that grew in the space Silas Vane's removal had opened. The ranch grew too, not dramatically, not the kind of growth that announced itself as transformation. The kind that happened because two people who had been managing separate internal lives finally stopped managing them separately and began gradually to live in the same direction. Everett had never talked much. She had known this from the first. He was a man who communicated through action, through presence, through the way he showed up reliably at exactly the moment he'd said he would, and did exactly what he'd said he'd do. She had valued this from the beginning, understood it as its own language, translated it without difficulty most of the time. What she hadn't fully understood in the first 6 months was how much he hadn't been saying. It came out incrementally over the winter, not in confessions or dramatic disclosures, but in the small opening that happened when two people stopped managing each other and started simply being honest. He told her about Clara, the first wife, the 4 years, the summer of the fever. Not the summary he'd given on the road to Laramie, but the full version with the specific details that made it real, the color of her hair in morning light, the particular habit she'd had of reading aloud when she thought no one was listening, the exact quality of the silence that had greeted him when he'd come home from his last assignment to find the neighbor woman on the porch with her hands folded. He told her about the 7 years between Clara and the agency advertisement, the building of the ranch, the way he'd structured his days to leave no empty time, because empty time was where the grief lived, and he had not been ready to live in it. The 3 false starts with the advertisement. The 17th letter. She told him things she hadn't written in any testimony. The years before the contract, when her father had been managing his failing finances with the particular desperate optimism of someone who had never fully admitted to himself what was happening. The way she had loved him, despite all of it, the specific intact love for a flawed person that didn't require the person to be different than they were, only wished some of the specific differences had been otherwise. The tin she'd saved her registration fee in an old tobacco tin her mother had used for buttons, which she had kept because it was the last physical object that had been her mother's, and which she had left behind when she'd fled because she couldn't carry it and run. Everett had listened to that last part with the quality of attention that meant he was filing it somewhere specific. 3 weeks later, a small package arrived at the Ridgeline General Store, addressed in handwriting she didn't recognize. Inside was an old tobacco tin, not her mother's tin, which was gone, but the same style with a small latch on the lid and the particular age smell of something that had been in a drawer for a long time. The note inside read in Everett's plain hand, not the same, but something. She had kept it on the bedroom dresser next to the cedar box. Spring came. The ranch work resumed its full seasonal weight calving, fencing the long days that started before light and ended after dark. She organized the correspondence work around the ranch calendar building habits that held when the days were longest, that could be condensed when they needed to be, and expanded when they didn't. In April, a letter arrived from Merritt. He had been approached, he wrote, by several women's assistance organizations in Cheyenne and Laramie who had become aware of what she was doing in Ridgeline. He had taken the liberty of speaking with them on her behalf, and they were interested in formalizing the arrangement, not subsuming it, he was careful to say, but connecting it to existing legal support networks so that the women who came to her had cleaner access to the full range of remedies available. He had also been approached separately by the Continental Marriage Agency, whose new management was apparently aware of the role their predecessor's corruption had played in her situation, and who were interested in establishing a formal vetting procedure for placement workers, a procedure they wanted her to help design. She read both parts of the letter, sitting at her desk with the morning coffee. Then she wrote back to Merritt and to the agency, both with the kind of specificity that came from 3 months of practical experience and the accumulated knowledge of 40-odd letters answered. She knew what was needed. She had learned it the hard way, which meant she had learned it completely. By summer, there was a name for what she was doing. Not an organization yet, not with offices and letterhead and formal articles of incorporation, though Merritt kept gently suggesting that those things would come. For now, just to name the Ridgeline Correspondence, which was what she'd written at the top of her letter since the beginning, because you had to call it something, and which had become among the women who knew about it, shorthand for someone who will answer and who knows what to do. Calvert had sent an unofficial endorsement to the marshal's office in Denver, describing the correspondence as a resource for women in difficult situations in the Wyoming territory. He had done this without telling her he was going to do it, which she discovered when Rideout's office began formally referring cases. She had written Calvert a letter about it. He had written back 3 lines, seemed useful, efficient use of existing resources. You were doing it anyway. She couldn't argue with any of that. Everett built her a sign for the study wall in the straightforward wood-burning style of a man who worked with his hands and knew how to make something that would last. Just the name Ridgeline Correspondence, and below it, in smaller letters, her own name. Not Mrs. Kane, Nora Kane. She had looked at it for a long moment when he'd brought it in and hung it. "That's right," she'd said. "I thought so," he said. The summer turned to fall, and fall turned to the first snow, and the letters kept coming, and she kept answering them, and the women who came to the ranch door kept coming, and she kept opening it, and the trial's 31-year verdict settled into the permanent record of what had happened and who had made it happen. Nora Kane had made it happen. She knew that. She also knew that she had not made it alone, not without Everett, not without Merritt and Calvert and Mrs. Hargrove and Walter Osgood, and the particular moment when a deputy marshal had bluffed a telegram and bought them time. Not without the courage of ordinary people doing small, specific things in the right direction. She had made it happen, and she had had help, and both things were true, and neither canceled the other. In December, just before the first hard freeze, a letter arrived from Ada Breckenridge in Rawlins. The property dispute was resolved. The business partner had been required under the applicable statute to produce documentation he did not have and could not fabricate, and the county recorder had ruled in Ada's favor, and the attorney in Casper had been excellent and had charged a reasonable fee. The property was hers. She and Clara were staying. "I want to do what you do," Ada wrote. "Not from Ridgeline, from Rawlins. I know this region. I know the women here. I know who needs this. Tell me how." Nora read the letter 3 times. Then she picked up her pen. She wrote back. Outside, the snow came down through the Wyoming dark with the steady, purposeful quality of something that intended to stay, and the lamp burned on the desk, and the cattle were in the barn, and Everett was asleep in the next room, and the cedar box was on the dresser with all its careful contents. The pen moved across the paper. She wrote about what she knew and what she'd learned and what it cost and what it was worth. She wrote specifically and practically the way she wrote everything. Not the way you wrote when you were hoping to inspire someone, but the way you wrote when you wanted someone to actually be able to do the thing. She finished at 11, folded the letter, addressed the envelope. She set it on the corner of the desk with the others going out tomorrow, and she capped the ink, and she blew out the lamp, and she walked through the quiet house to the bedroom. She lay down in the dark beside her husband. He didn't wake. She hadn't expected him to. She lay still and listened to the snow coming down outside and the cattle shifting in the barn and the fire settling in the kitchen stove. All the familiar sounds of a house that was doing what a house was supposed to do. She had been afraid for 2 years. She had stopped. Everything had followed from that. She closed her eyes and the snow kept falling. And somewhere in Rawlins, a woman named Ada Breckenridge was going to open a letter in the morning. And somewhere in Carbon County, a woman with a property dispute was going to get a response next week. And somewhere in the territory, in more places than she could count, Women who were still running were moving through the dark without knowing yet that there were people who would stop and stand the line with them if they could just find their way to the right door. There would always be more letters. She would always answer them, not because she had to, not because fear or obligation or the particular weight of what she had survived required it, but because she had chosen it the same way she had chosen this house and this desk and this man sleeping beside her in the dark. Freely, fully, without reservation. She had learned the hard way that choice was the thing, that everything else, safety, love, purpose, home, lived inside it. She had made her choice. She was still making it every day. That was the whole of the story, and the whole of the story was enough. Years later, how many she had stopped counting, the way you stopped counting when time began to feel like abundance rather than something you were running out of. A young woman came to the ranch door on a cold November morning and knocked with the careful, controlled insistence of someone who has traveled a long way and is not entirely sure of their reception. She was 19. Her name was Ruth. She had left a situation in Nebraska 3 days ago on a horse she'd borrowed from a neighbor she trusted with a small bag and a name written on a piece of paper, ridgeline correspondence. Ask for Nora Kane, Miss Kane. Nora opened the door. Ruth looked at her with the expression she had learned to recognize immediately, the particular vigilance of someone who has been frightened for so long that their face had reorganized itself around it. She saw in Ruth's face every woman who had come to this door, and behind them every woman who had not been able to find a door to come to. She saw the version of herself that had stood in a kitchen 6 years ago with bruises on her jaw and a lie ready about porch steps. "Come in," she said. Ruth came in. Everett was in the kitchen. He looked up when they entered and assessed the situation with the same quiet efficiency he brought to everything. And he stood and went to the stove and put water on and left the kitchen without making a production of it, giving them the space that was needed and the knowledge that someone who could be trusted was close by. Ruth sat down. She looked at the desk in the small office off the kitchen, the letters organized in their stacks, the lamp, the sign on the wall with its plain burned letters. "Someone in Cheyenne told me about this place," she said. "Said you helped women like me." "Tell me what's happened," Nora said. "Take your time," Ruth told her. It took an hour. Some of it was difficult to hear. Nora listened to all of it without flinching, without offering comfort that would interrupt the telling, without doing any of the things that well-meaning people did that turned a woman's story into something they could manage rather than something they needed to say. When Ruth finished, there was a long moment of quiet. Then Nora said, "Here is what you have. Here is what the law says about it. Here is who to contact and in what order, and here is what to say when you do." She said it clearly and specifically. She had been saying it for years. She would say it for years more. Outside the kitchen window, Wyoming spread itself in the November light, the wide, indifferent, magnificent country that had taught her the particular kind of courage that came not from knowing you would win, but from deciding to stay regardless. The coffee was hot. The desk was ready. The letters were there to be answered. She was exactly where she chose to be. That was the ending. That was always the ending. Not a single moment of triumph, but the daily chosen fact of remaining. The decision made and remade to be the kind of person who stayed, who stood the line, who opened the door when someone knocked. She had been afraid for 2 years. Then she had stopped. And in the space that a stopping had made, she had built something that could not be taken from her sheer, not by contracts or by men who thought they owned things, not by the long arm of old fear or the particular weight of everything she had survived. She had built a life, and she intended to keep living it.